Before sunrise reaches the pyramids, the Great Sphinx is already awake. Its face looks east across the pale floor of the Nile Valley, waiting for a sun that has risen before it for more than 4,000 years. Behind its weathered head, the pyramid of Khafre cuts into the fading darkness. Around its paws, limestone walls hold the night's last shadows. The desert appears still, but the monument is not standing in open emptiness. It occupies a trench cut deep into the Giza Plateau, as though the earth itself has opened to release a creature that was always sleeping inside the stone. From a distance, it seems complete and deliberate, a human head joined to the body of a lion, guarding the Western cemetery of kings. Up close, the certainty begins to dissolve. Its body is layered, cracked, patched, and scarred. Its original surface survives only in places. Its temples were left without clear inscriptions explaining who ordered it, what name it first carried, or precisely what ceremonies unfolded before it. Even the familiar title Great Sphinx belongs to a later world. The people who carved it may have called it something entirely different, but that name has vanished. This silence is one reason the monument has attracted so many stories. A pyramid contains chambers, passages, inscriptions added by later visitors, and an unmistakable connection to royal burial. The Sphinx offers no internal room in which its purpose can be neatly stored. It is not built from stacked courses rising toward a summit. It is a mass of native limestone reduced, shaped, and refined until a guardian emerged. The workers did not bring the body to Giza. They removed the plateau from around it. This distinction matters, because the Sphinx cannot be separated easily from the geological accident that made it possible. It is part statue, part quarry remnant, part architecture, and part landscape. Its existence depended on a particular outcrop of limestone lying in precisely the right place beside one of the most ambitious royal building programs in human history. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The story ahead is not about proving that the Sphinx came from a lost civilization or conceals an archive beneath its paws. It is about something quieter and, in many ways, stranger. Why ancient Egypt created this singular guardian and then never created another monument quite like it. Egypt did not abandon colossal sculpture after Giza. Centuries later, enormous seated kings would face the Nile at Thebes. Obelisks would rise above temple courts. Granite sphinxes would line ceremonial routes, and royal statues would be produced in numbers that the builders of the Fourth Dynasty could scarcely have imagined. The Sphinx itself would be copied, reinterpreted, renamed, excavated, buried, worshipped, repaired, and claimed by rulers who lived long after the intentions of its makers had become obscure. Yet no later pharaoh carved another lion-bodied royal guardian of comparable scale directly from a bedrock mass and joined it so completely to a pyramid landscape. The tradition continued, but the experiment did not. At first, that absence seemed surprising. Ancient Egyptian kings repeatedly borrowed the imagery of their predecessors. They restored old sanctuaries, copied revered forms, reused royal names, and revived artistic styles from earlier ages. A successful monument could inspire generations of imitation. Pyramid building itself spread beyond Giza, even as later pyramids became smaller and were constructed differently. The Sphinx form also survived for millennia, but the precise combination seen here, the vast recumbent lion, the royal human head, the natural limestone core, the adjacent temples, the causeway, the Western Pyramid and the solar horizon appears only once, Its uniqueness may begin with the place. The Giza Plateau is not a blank sheet upon which architects could draw freely. It is a layered limestone formation shaped by ancient seas, erosion, fractures, and variations in hardness. The Sphinx's head was carved from a more resistant layer than much of its body, which helps explain why the head survives in relatively strong relief, while the torso has suffered severe decay. Lower bands of softer stone weathered more quickly and required repeated repairs. The monument's strange proportions may also reflect the material available. Its head appears small beside its enormous body, perhaps not because the planners misunderstood anatomy, but because the stone dictated limits. The sculptors could remove rock. They could not add a larger natural core where none existed. There is even a modern scientific suggestion that nature may have begun the process before any royal project reached the site. Experiments involving wind erosion have shown that a raised mass of material can gradually develop a streamlined form resembling a recumbent animal, with a narrower front and broader body behind it. In desert geology, such wind-shaped ridges are known as yardangs. This does not mean that the Sphinx formed naturally, or that its human face and lion anatomy appeared without sculptors. Tool marks, cut surfaces, quarry walls, and architectural relationships leave no doubt that ancient workers shaped the monument. But the original outcrop may already have possessed a suggestive profile. Nature may have offered a rough shape, and royal planners may have recognized its potential. The evidence remains incomplete. Yet the possibility gives the monument an unusual origin, not a statue conceived entirely on papyrus and assembled block by block, but a negotiation between geology and imagination. As dawn finally breaks over the eastern horizon, light reaches the face first, the forehead brightens, then the cheeks, the chest, and the long forepaws extending toward the rising sun. This daily sequence would not have been lost on ancient observers. Egyptian kingship was bound to cycles of renewal, to the sun's emergence in the east and disappearance into the realm of the dead in the west. The Giza pyramids stood on that western margin, where cultivated land gave way to desert, and where royal bodies were placed beyond the world of ordinary settlement. The Sphinx faced away from the tombs and toward sunrise. It watched the living valley while keeping the necropolis behind it. Yet calling it merely a guard may be too simple. Later Egyptians knew the monument as Horemakhet, Horus in the horizon, a solar and royal being rather than a decorative sentinel. That name is securely documented many centuries after its creation, particularly during the 18th dynasty, when the Sphinx was uncovered from the sand and given renewed religious importance. Whether the 4th dynasty builders used the same title is unknown. No surviving Old Kingdom inscription beside the statue tells us. What survives in the record suggests that the monument's meaning was rooted in kingship, solar power, and the sacred horizon. But scholars still debate how these ideas were combined at the moment of its creation. The face has often been treated as a portrait, most commonly of Khafre, whose pyramid rises behind it and whose valley temple and causeway stand beside it. The association is strong, but not absolute. There is no carved label beneath the chin naming the king. The monument's builders left no foundation text saying that Khafre ordered the work. Instead, the argument must be reconstructed from stone layers, quarry sequences, architecture, alignments, and the order in which nearby structures were built. It is a case assembled from relationships rather than a single declaration. That is why responsible archaeology can say that Khafre is the most likely patron, while still admitting that certainty remains beyond reach. Seen in the growing daylight, The Sphinx is both less supernatural and more extraordinary than legend makes it. It does not require forgotten machines or an unknown civilization. Its mystery lies in the surviving evidence itself, an immense royal image cut from imperfect stone, joined to temples that may never have been completed, linked to a king whose name is nowhere carved upon it, and left without a true successor. To understand why, the monument must first be stripped of its later names and stories. The familiar guardian has to disappear for a moment, leaving only a limestone ridge on a busy plateau, surrounded by quarries, workers, ramps, harbours, temples, and the rising ambitions of the Fourth Dynasty. Long before the face of the Sphinx acquired a name, the plateau around it was already being transformed into a royal landscape. Giza did not begin as an empty desert chosen for a single burst of construction. Its limestone heights overlook the Nile floodplain, visible from far across the cultivated valley, and its western position placed it within the ancient geography of death and renewal. Earlier graves had already marked the wider region, but during the Fourth Dynasty the scale of royal ambition changed dramatically. Stone was no longer used merely to enclose a burial. It became a medium through which kingship could reorganize an entire horizon. To the east, the Nile Valley carried food, people, timber, copper, tools, and information. The river was Egypt's great road, but the main channel known today was not the only waterway available in antiquity. Geological and remote sensing research has identified the traces of an ancient branch running near the western desert margin, close to many pyramid fields. Known to modern researchers as the Horemakhet branch, it helps explain how construction materials and supplies could reach places that now appear isolated from the river. The exact form and navigability of the waterways near Giza changed through time, and scholars still debate the details. But the plateau was not as cut off from transport as the modern landscape suggests. Harbours, canals, flood basins, and seasonal water routes brought the machinery of the state to the foot of the desert. This missing waterscape matters because the Sphinx was born inside a system of movement. Stone blocks passed from quarries to building sites. Work crews moved between settlements, storage areas, workshops, temples, ramps, and landing places. Officials recorded rations and assignments. Bakers produced bread at an industrial scale. Brewers prepared the drink that formed part of ordinary sustenance. Animal bones from worker settlements show organized provisioning rather than a population abandoned to survive on scraps. The great monuments rose through administration as much as through strength. Their scale required a government able to gather resources from across the country and concentrate them for years in one place. The plateau itself supplied much of the stone. As builders cut downward and outward to produce blocks, they changed the ground into terraces, quarry faces, trenches, and raised masses. The future Sphinx stood within this working landscape as a core of rock that had not been removed. It may originally have been left because the stone was less useful, because the outcrop interrupted quarry plans, or because its position and shape invited a different purpose. No surviving document records the first decision. What remains is the result workers excavated around the mass, lowering the surrounding floor and leaving the body attached to the bedrock beneath it. The act of carving therefore began with absence. Every curve of the lion's flank represented limestone taken away. The space now called the Sphinx enclosure was not constructed by adding walls around the statue. It was created by cutting down into the plateau. The walls of that enclosure preserve the same geological bands visible across the body, making the monument and its surroundings part of a single rock formation. This continuity allowed later archaeologists to follow individual layers from the cut walls into the statue and then, in some cases, into blocks used in nearby buildings. The connection is especially important around the Sphinx Temple. Large limestone blocks in its core appear to have come from the excavation of the Sphinx enclosure. The builders were not simply carving a statue beside a temple, they were producing both at once. Stone removed to reveal the guardian became material for the architecture facing it. The creature and its ritual setting emerged from the same operation, one through subtraction and the other through assembly. This is among the strongest reasons to understand the Sphinx not as an isolated sculpture, but as one element of a larger plan. Nearby stood the Valley Temple associated with Khafre, built with massive limestone cores faced in granite. From there, a causeway rose toward the King's Pyramid complex on higher ground. The causeway passed immediately beside the Sphinx enclosure, constraining its northern edge and linking the lower temples to the royal monument above. The sequence of construction is complex, and not every relationship can be dated with perfect confidence. But the spatial arrangement strongly binds the Sphinx to the Khafre program. The Guardian occupies the lower threshold of a path that joined river access, temple ritual, pyramid, and Western burial. At the time, the pyramid would have looked very different from the weathered structure seen today. Smooth casing stones once caught the sun, creating a brilliant artificial mountain above the plateau. Khafre's pyramid stood close to the earlier Great Pyramid of Khufu, yet the slightly higher ground beneath it helped make it appear almost equal in height. Royal architecture at Giza was not modest in its visual calculations. Each complex spoke to what came before while attempting to establish its own command over the landscape. The Sphinx may have been one of the most daring additions to that competition, not another pyramid, but a living form fused with the earth. Its location at the lower end of Khafre's complex may have carried several meanings at once. The lion was an ancient symbol of physical power, especially the force of the king overcoming disorder. A human royal head joined to a lion's body transformed that strength into an image of controlled authority. Facing east, the monument also participated in the daily return of sunlight. Behind it, the pyramid occupied the western zone of burial, between sunrise and tomb, valley and desert, living fields and royal necropolis. The Sphinx rested at a boundary where Egyptian religious ideas often gathered their power. The exact rituals planned for the monument remain uncertain. The Sphinx Temple contains two sanctuaries aligned roughly east and west, and its architecture appears sensitive to the movement of the sun. Around the equinoxes, observers in the temple area could see the setting sun near the Pyramid of Khafre, creating a dramatic union of solar disk, royal monument, and horizon. Such alignments are not proof of a single rigid theology, but they suggest that the builders designed with celestial effects in mind. The sun did not merely illuminate the complex, it completed the image. Yet one of the strangest details is that this impressive ritual setting may never have functioned as intended. The Sphinx Temple appears unfinished in important respects. Some flooring and wall treatments were not completed, and clear evidence for an established Old Kingdom priesthood serving the Sphinx is absent from the tombs and titles around Giza. Egyptian religious institutions often left administrative traces. Priests named themselves by office, families recorded service, and cults generated enduring economic structures. For the Sphinx in the Fourth Dynasty, that evidence is missing. Absence cannot prove that no ceremonies occurred, but it raises the possibility that the original program was interrupted before becoming a fully operating cult. If so, the earlier Sphinx may have been grander in image than in institutional life. It could have stood beside a temple awaiting final completion, while political priorities shifted. A king died, or resources moved elsewhere. The monument may have been visually finished enough to dominate the landscape, but ritually incomplete. No single explanation fully accounts for the evidence, and later repairs make the original state difficult to reconstruct. Still, the idea changes the atmosphere of the site. The Sphinx was perhaps not born into centuries of uninterrupted worship. It may have begun as the surviving centerpiece of an unfinished royal vision. Even its first audience is difficult to recover. Workers and officials knew the practical realities of its creation. Priests and royal architects may have understood symbolic meanings now lost. Sailors approaching along waterways could have seen the pyramid rising above the desert edge. Visitors entering the lower complex may have encountered the lion-bodied figure as a manifestation of royal power, rather than as an ancient mystery. It was new then, its features sharper, its headdress more complete, its body covered with smoother stone surfaces and perhaps painted. Traces suggest that colour once enlivened parts of the face. The pale monument familiar today is the result of weathering, not necessarily the image its makers intended. There was no riddle attached to it, no Greek monster guarding the road to Thebes, no medieval legend of hidden chambers, and no modern dispute over forgotten civilizations. There was only a royal form emerging from a quarry at the edge of a functioning state. Its first name, if it possessed one, has not survived. Its earliest theological identity is inferred from position, form, and architecture rather than stated in a text. Before it became Horemakhet, before it became the Great Sphinx, it was a newly carved presence within Khafre's landscape, facing a river world that has since shifted away and standing beside a temple that may have fallen silent almost as soon as it was made. The Great Sphinx did not rise stone by stone. It emerged as workers cut the plateau down around it, releasing a form that remained attached to the bedrock beneath. This method gave the monument its overwhelming presence, but it also imposed every weakness of the limestone upon the finished body. A block-built statue can be assembled from selected stone. The Sphinx had to accept whatever layers nature had placed in that exact location millions of years earlier. Its strength, proportions, surface, and later decay were determined before the first chisel struck. The limestone of Giza is not uniform. Some layers are compact and resistant, while others are softer, more fractured, and easily worn by salt, wind, moisture, and temperature change. The head was carved from a harder section of the formation, allowing the facial mass to survive with greater definition. Much of the body lies within weaker bands. These softer layers could be shaped more readily, but they also deteriorated faster. Over time, hollows widened, surfaces flaked, and parts of the lion's form required repeated masonry repairs. The familiar monument is therefore not simply the original sculpture weathered evenly across 4,000 years. It is a geological core wrapped in a long and complicated history of intervention. Carving began on a scale closer to quarrying than to ordinary sculpture. Workers first had to isolate the mass by cutting trenches around it. Stone tools, hard pounding stones, copper implements, wooden levers, and abrasive materials were used in combinations suited to different tasks. Copper alone was too soft to slice effortlessly through massive limestone. But Egyptian stoneworking never depended on a single miraculous tool. Repeated blows, abrasion, wedging, levering, and organized labor could remove enormous volumes of rock. The builders of Giza already possessed generations of experience in quarrying, leveling, dressing, and transporting stone. The Sphinx demanded those same skills, but applied to a body that could not be moved or replaced if damaged. The workers likely approached the monument in stages, first roughing out the main mass, then refining the lion's body, shoulders, chest, paws, head, headdress, ears, and face. The surviving surface no longer preserves a complete sequence of tool marks, because erosion and later restoration have obscured much of the original workmanship. Yet the logic of subtraction remains visible. The enclosure walls show where horizontal bands of limestone were removed. The body records how those bands continued through the core. The statue and the trench are two halves of the same act. One is the rock left behind, the other the space created by taking it away. This method also produced building material. The immense blocks cut from the enclosure did not simply become waste-scattered across the plateau. Many were carried a short distance and used in the nearby Sphinx Temple. Geological matching has allowed researchers to connect layers in the enclosure walls with core blocks in the temple masonry. The evidence does not rest on visual similarity alone. The sequence of stone bands, their thickness, and their physical characteristics help reconstruct where particular blocks originated. In effect, the temple preserves pieces of the empty space around the statue. That relationship creates a rare kind of architectural unity. The Sphinx was carved from one portion of the plateau, while its temple was built from the stone removed to reveal it. The guardian and its ritual architecture were physically related before either was complete. The temple was not added centuries later as an independent response to a mysterious ancient statue. Its core belonged to the same original operation. This strengthens the link between the monument and the Fourth Dynasty building program. Even though the absence of a dedicatory inscription prevents absolute certainty about patronage, the Sphinx Temple itself was designed on a monumental scale. Massive limestone blocks formed its walls, later intended to receive finer stone facings. Its interior included an open court surrounded by pillars and recesses, with sanctuaries oriented toward the east and west. The plan seems to have been deeply concerned with sunlight. Morning illumination entered from the direction faced by the Sphinx, while evening light connected the temple to the western horizon and Khafre's pyramid beyond. The monument's body lay between these solar movements, as if the lion were anchored within the path of the sun. Yet the temple's unfinished state introduces a contradiction. The quarrying and carving required exceptional effort, but portions of the associated architecture appear not to have received their final surfaces. Floors and walls may have been left incomplete. There is no secure evidence that a fully established Old Kingdom cult operated there over generations. The project achieved visual grandeur without leaving the institutional traces expected from a major functioning temple. Scholars still debate whether work stopped because Khafre died, because construction priorities changed, or because the complex was completed in a form different from modern expectations. What survives in the record suggests interruption, but not the precise reason. The statue itself may also have been altered during carving. Its disproportionately small head has inspired many theories, including the suggestion that an earlier lion's head was recut into a human face. There is no firm archaeological proof for such a transformation. A simpler explanation lies in the available rock. The harder upper outcrop may have limited the size and shape of the head, while the long natural ridge behind it provided sufficient mass for the body. Ancient sculptors were skilled, but they could not enlarge the bedrock. Their design had to fit the surviving core. The lion's back is low and elongated. Its forepaws extend far ahead, enclosed today by later masonry. The chest rises sharply toward the head, giving the monument greater height from the front than its side profile suggests. This shape may reflect both symbolic intention and the natural form of the outcrop. The modern Yardang experiments offer one possible clue. Wind moving around an isolated mass can produce a narrow, elevated front and a broader, tapering body behind it. The ancient builders may have encountered a weathered ridge that already hinted at an animal at rest. If so, they did not merely impose a shape on neutral stone. They recognized, exaggerated, and disciplined a form suggested by the terrain. This possibility should not be confused with the claim that nature created the Sphinx. The human face, royal headdress, paws, chest, body contours, enclosure, and temples required deliberate planning and labor. Natural erosion may have provided a starting silhouette, but royal craftsmen transformed it into an image of kingship. The distinction matters because the monument's power comes partly from this fusion. It looks less like an object placed upon the desert than a being belonging to it. During construction, the enclosure would have been crowded and noisy. Teams removed rubble from narrow working areas. Stone dust filled the air. Ramps or temporary pathways allowed blocks to be dragged away. Supervisors coordinated quarrying with temple construction. Surveyors checked axes and levels. Sculptors refined areas that could not be corrected once too much rock had been removed. Every decision carried permanence. A damaged block in a temple wall could be replaced. A mistake in the Sphinx's face could not. The final surface was probably much smoother than it appears now. Parts may have received plaster or fine stone repairs even in antiquity, especially where weak geological layers produced irregularities. Colour added another layer of transformation. Traces associated with the face and headdress have encouraged the view that painted details once made the features more vivid. Red pigment may have covered the face, while other colours distinguished the headdress and sacred elements. The original Sphinx may have looked less like bare geology, and more like a brilliant royal image rising from pale stone. Its completed form must have produced a powerful illusion. The monument remained fixed to the earth, yet the long paws and lifted head made it appear alert. The body belonged to the plateau, but the face belonged to a king. The surrounding trench concealed the lower mass from distant viewers, so the head could seem to rise suddenly above the landscape. From within the enclosure, the scale became overwhelming. From farther away, the statue merged with pyramid, temple, and horizon. The workers who released this guardian from the limestone could not know that future generations would repeatedly rebuild its sides, excavate it from sand, scan it with lasers, and debate whether its first shape had been suggested by the wind. They knew only the demands of the stone before them. The Sphinx became singular because it was inseparable from that stone. It could be copied in granite, recast in smaller statues, and repeated along temple avenues. But another true successor would require another plateau, another suitable outcrop, another royal program, and another moment when geology and kingship aligned. That combination would never occur in quite the same way again. The face of the Great Sphinx seems familiar because it has been reproduced so often, yet almost every feature through which modern viewers recognize it has been altered by damage, erosion, repair, or imagination. The nose is gone. The ceremonial beard survives only in fragments. The edges of the royal headdress have softened. The lips, cheeks, and eyes retain enough form to suggest expression, but not enough to make portrait identification simple. This weathered face has been asked to carry more certainty than the stone can provide. It is commonly called the face of Khafre, and that remains the strongest mainstream interpretation, but the monument itself never says so. No inscription carved during the 4th dynasty names its owner. No foundation deposit has been found beneath the pores declaring who ordered the work. No surviving administrative record describes the sculptors, the schedule, or the intended cult. The association with Khafre rests instead on context, the position of the Sphinx beside his causeway, the geological and architectural relationship between its enclosure and neighbouring temples, the apparent sequence of construction, and the way the monument fits the symbolic landscape of his pyramid complex. Archaeology often works through such accumulated relationships. A conclusion may become persuasive without becoming absolute. Khafre ruled during the Great Age of Giza, after Khufu, builder of the Great Pyramid. His own pyramid rises immediately behind the Sphinx when viewed from the east, creating one of the most powerful compositions in ancient architecture. Because Khafre's monument stands on slightly higher ground, it appears almost as tall as Khufu's despite being physically smaller. Its surviving casing near the summit preserves a hint of the brilliant outer surface that once covered the entire form. At the lower end of the complex, the Valley Temple, Causeway, Sphinx Temple, and Carved Guardian appear to form a connected program. The Sphinx is not merely near Khafre's works, it is caught within their geometry. The causeway is especially important. It runs from the valley area toward Khafre's pyramid and passes along the northern side of the Sphinx enclosure. Its presence influenced the shape of the excavation and restricted how the monument could be cut from the plateau. This suggests that the Sphinx was carved in relation to an existing or developing plan for Khafre's complex. The exact construction sequence is still debated, but the architecture does not look like a random later statue inserted into open ground. Each element appears to respond to the others. The temples strengthen that link. The Valley Temple is securely associated with Khafre through its setting, sculpture, and connection to the pyramid causeway. Several famous seated statues of the king were found there, including images showing him protected by the falcon god Horus. These statues present a calm, idealized ruler, rather than an individual captured with modern photographic realism. The Sphinx's face belongs to this same broad language of royal image-making, symmetrical, controlled, youthful, and removed from ordinary age. It was not designed to reveal private character. It was designed to make kingship visible. This makes facial comparison difficult. Attempts have been made to compare the Sphinx with statues of Khafre, measuring the shape of the jaw, lips, eyes, ears, and head. Some observers see convincing similarities. Others argue that the surviving face differs too much, or that erosion has erased the details needed for reliable identification. Ancient Egyptian royal portraits were not neutral records. Sculptors followed conventions, repeated ideal features, and adjusted images to suit scale, material, and divine meaning. Two statues of the same king could look different, while statues of different kings could share a family resemblance created by style rather than biology. The surviving head also appears small in relation to the lion's body, which has encouraged speculation that it was recarved from an earlier form. Some popular theories propose that the original head was that of a lion, later reduced into a royal face. Others assign the monument to an earlier king, an unknown ruler, or a civilization far older than dynastic Egypt. None of these claims is supported by clear archaeological evidence. Recarving is possible in principle, but possibility is not proof. The head size can be explained more cautiously by the shape and hardness of the available bedrock. A sculptor working with a natural mass cannot enlarge what geology has not provided. Alternative royal candidates have also been proposed. Khufu is sometimes suggested because the Sphinx lies within the broader Giza landscape created under his reign, and because some writers believe the face resembles a small ivory figure attributed to him. Khafre, Khufu's successor and Khafre's predecessor, has also been placed into the debate, partly because royal lion imagery was important during this period, and because dynastic relationships at Giza were complex. Yet these proposals lack the strong architectural association that links the Sphinx to Khafre's lower complex. They remain minority interpretations rather than equal alternatives. The most convincing case for Khafre does not depend on the face alone. It depends on treating the monument as part of a construction sequence. Stone removed from the Sphinx enclosure was used in the core of the Sphinx Temple. That temple stands beside the Valley Temple and near the beginning of Khafre's causeway. The arrangement suggests a coordinated project, probably completed or left partly incomplete during Khafre's reign. Marking the guardian with the king's image would fit the political and religious logic of the site. A royal head on a lion's body could embody the living king as a force protecting and animating the sacred complex. The lion was especially suited to this role. In Egyptian imagery, lions occupied the dangerous margins of the ordered world. They belonged to the desert, the horizon, heat, strength, and the power to destroy enemies. Two lions placed back to back could symbolize yesterday and tomorrow, guarding the sun's passage through time. A king joined to a lion did not become an animal in a simple literal sense. He absorbed its force while remaining recognizably human and royal. The striped Nemes headdress, once more complete than it is today, identified the head as a ruler's. The missing beard may have reinforced the same authority. Yet the Sphinx is not merely a colossal statue of a man with an animal body. Its face was designed to be seen under changing light. At sunrise, shadows withdraw from the eyes and mouth. At sunset, the features darken while the pyramid behind catches the last light. Viewed from the east, the head sits against the western horizon where the sun disappears. The face therefore operated simultaneously as portrait, symbol, and part of a celestial composition. Whether it represented Khafre specifically or royal power more generally, it belonged to a visual theology larger than individual likeness. Later, Egyptians inherited the monument after much of its original context had already been forgotten. They did not preserve a clear Fourth Dynasty tradition naming Khafre as its maker. During the New Kingdom, the Sphinx became Horemakhet, Horus in the horizon, and rulers approached it as an ancient divine presence. This later identity may preserve elements of earlier solar meaning, but it also shows how monuments acquire new lives when their first explanations disappear. A royal face can outlast the name it once displayed. This loss of identity is one of the monument's central paradoxes. The image was intended to make kingship eternal, yet the king's name was not secured to it in a form that survived. The face dominates the plateau, but its owner must be reconstructed through surrounding stone. The monument appears personal, but its features are idealized. It looks toward the living world, yet the person it may portray has remained silent for more than 4 millennia. Khafre remains the most likely answer because the landscape points toward him from nearly every direction. His pyramid rises behind the guardian, his causeway borders it, his temples share its construction history, his reign fits the technology, style, and ambition required. Still, responsible interpretation leaves a narrow space for doubt. The evidence is strong enough to guide the story, but incomplete enough to preserve the mystery. The face behind the guardian is probably Khafre's, though what the Sphinx ultimately represents is larger than any single human face. The Great Sphinx is easy to recognize because its design appears simple. the head of a king on the body of a lion. Yet almost nothing about that combination was simple to an ancient Egyptian viewer. Every part of the monument carried meanings that overlapped and changed depending on where it was seen, when it was approached, and which ritual or royal idea surrounded it. The Sphinx was not a puzzle assembled from unrelated pieces. It was a single image designed to make several kinds of power appear in one body. The human head established intelligence, identity, and kingship. It prevented the creature from being understood as a natural lion, however enormous. The remains of the striped royal headdress framed the face and once extended farther down the sides of the head. A ceremonial beard may have reinforced the same message. These elements did not depict an ordinary man. They mark the figure as royal and, by extension, as a being standing between the human and divine worlds. Egyptian kings were mortal, but kingship was presented as an office sustained by the gods, renewed through ritual and necessary to the balance of the cosmos. The lion's body added a different form of authority. Lions were not common sights in the cultivated centre of Egypt, but they occupied the desert margins and appeared frequently in royal imagery. They represented strength, speed, heat, danger, and the power to dominate forces beyond order. Kings were shown hunting lions or compared with them in battle. A lion could protect, but it could also destroy. Its presence beside the Western Cemetery therefore carried an edge. The guardian was not passive. It embodied controlled violence held in permanent readiness. This distinction matters because modern viewers often imagine the Sphinx as a calm philosopher in stone. Its stillness seems meditative, and the damaged face has acquired an expression of distant patience. But the original image was likely more forceful. The paws extend forward as those of an alert animal at rest, not a sleeping one. The chest rises high, the head remains upright. A recumbent lion can spring. The monument's power lies partly in that suspended possibility, a body resting without surrendering its strength. The fusion of king and lion created an image that was more than either part alone. The human head gave direction to animal force. The lion's body gave physical power to royal intelligence. Together they represented a ruler who could defend order without being consumed by the chaos he defeated. This was central to Egyptian ideas of kingship. The king was expected to maintain Ma'at, the principle of balance, justice, continuity, and right arrangement. Beyond the ordered world lay disorder, symbolized by enemies, desert, darkness, rebellion, and forces that threatened the daily return of the sun. Royal images did not simply celebrate political authority. They presented the king as the figure who kept creation from slipping back into confusion. At Giza, this protective role was embedded in geography. The Sphinx faced east toward the Nile Valley and the rising sun. Behind it lay the pyramid fields and the western land of burial. The cultivated valley represented life, fertility, and human settlement. The desert held tombs, quarries, danger, and sacred space. The monument stood between these zones, not as a wall but as a living threshold. It watched the approach from the east while resting within the stone of the west. Its orientation gave the statue a solar meaning that later generations would make explicit. By the New Kingdom, the Sphinx was known as Horemakhet, Horus in the horizon. Horus was closely linked to kingship, sky, and royal legitimacy. The horizon was not merely a line in the distance. It was the place of emergence and disappearance, where the sun entered and left the visible world. To call the Sphinx Horus in the horizon transformed the monument into a divine presence tied to solar renewal. Whether the Fourth Dynasty builders used that exact name is unknown. The later title may preserve an older idea, or it may represent a reinterpretation created when the original meaning had already faded. Scholars still debate how directly New Kingdom beliefs can be projected backward. Yet the monument's orientation, its relationship to the temples, and its position before Khafre's pyramid all support a solar dimension. Even without the later name, the Sphinx belonged to a landscape organized around the path of the sun. The temples beside it appear to strengthen that connection. Their east-west orientation, openings, courts, and sanctuaries created controlled relationships with dawn and sunset. At certain times of year, the setting sun appears behind Khafre's pyramid when viewed from the Sphinx Temple area. The effect joins the solar disk with the king's pyramid and the horizon line. Such alignments may have been part of a larger symbolic program in which the dead king, the living ruler, and the sun's cycle reinforced one another. The Sphinx occupied the center of this composition without needing to move. In the morning, it received the rising sun on its face. In the evening, the sun passed behind it toward the royal tomb. The monument thus connected two directions of sacred time rebirth in the east and passage into the west. Its body remained fixed, but light transformed it repeatedly. The builders may have understood that the sun would become part of the sculpture, revealing and hiding its features in a daily rhythm. The lion itself had strong associations with the horizon. In later Egyptian symbolism, paired lions could represent the eastern and western horizons, yesterday and tomorrow, or the boundaries through which the sun travelled. This does not mean the Great Sphinx was simply one half of a missing pair. No archaeological evidence confirms that a second colossal lion once faced it. But the broader symbolism helps explain why a lion-bodied royal figure was so appropriate at the edge of the necropolis. The lion belonged to the place where the sun entered and departed, and the king claimed mastery over that passage. Protective power could also be expressed through scale. A small guardian protects a doorway. The Sphinx protects a landscape. Its head rises above the enclosure, allowing the face to remain visible even when parts of the body are hidden by the trench or later by sand. Seen from the valley, it would have appeared connected to the pyramid behind it. The monument did not need to block access physically. Its presence transformed approach into submission. Anyone entering the lower complex came beneath the gaze of royal power. Colour would have intensified that effect. The surviving stone gives the impression of a pale, unified creature, but ancient Egyptian sculpture was often painted. Traces suggest that the face may once have carried red pigment, while the headdress and other elements could have been distinguished by additional colours. The eyes may have appeared sharper, the mouth clearer, and the royal head more visually separate from the lion's body. What now seems weathered and restrained may once have been vivid and authoritative. The ceremonial beard, known from surviving fragments, added another layer. Such beards were not ordinary facial hair reproduced naturalistically. They were symbols associated with royalty and divinity. Their presence extended the face downward and emphasized the formal identity of the figure. The lost uraeus, the rearing cobra usually placed on a king's forehead, may once have crowned the headdress. The cobra represented protective force and could strike at enemies of the ruler. Its disappearance removes a small but important clue to the monument's original intensity. Later repairs and alterations complicate every reconstruction. Parts of the body were faced with masonry, and the forepaws were rebuilt more than once. Some features may have been added or renewed during later periods. The monument seen today is therefore the accumulated result of ancient carving, weathering, restoration, and loss. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single restoration drawing can recover every original detail with confidence. Still, the symbolic structure remains clear. The Sphinx joined the king to the lion to the desert to the horizon, and the horizon to the sun. It linked physical strength with sacred legitimacy. It protected a royal landscape while also participating in the daily cycle of cosmic renewal. It could be read as Khafre, as kingship itself, as a solar guardian, or as several of these at once. This layered meaning helps explain why the monument could survive changes in religion and politics. Later Egyptians did not need to know precisely what Khafre's architects intended. The figure was flexible enough to receive new names and new devotion. Its body already contained the central ingredients of Egyptian sacred power: king, animal, horizon, sun, and stone. What changed was not the monument's ability to signify, but the stories placed around it. The Sphinx had no heir of equal form, yet its symbolic descendants were everywhere. Smaller sphinxes guarded temples, royal avenues filled with lion-bodied figures, queens and kings adopted the form. Colossal statues continued to embody divine authority. The original guardian remained unique not because its language was forgotten, but because its language proved easier to repeat in movable stone than in an entire landscape. The idea survived. The geological body did not. The symbolic body of the Sphinx makes full sense only when the buildings beside it are restored in the imagination. Today the statue often appears alone, isolated against the desert, but its original setting was architectural, crowded, and carefully controlled. Massive walls shaped how visitors approached. Temple courts framed the sky. Causeways directed movement uphill toward the pyramid. The guardian was not placed in open space merely to be admired from every angle. It belonged to a sequence of arrival, purification, ritual, ascent, and royal transformation. Immediately east of the Sphinx stood the structure now called the Sphinx Temple. Its heavy limestone core was built from blocks cut out, while the enclosure around the statue was being excavated. That physical relationship made the temple and guardian two products of the same quarrying operation. Stone removed from the lion's sides became the walls before its paws. The monument was revealed through subtraction, while its temple rose through addition. The temple's appearance in the 4th dynasty would have been far more imposing than the worn foundations suggest today. Its core blocks were enormous, some weighing many tons, and they were probably intended to receive finer facing stone. Visitors approaching from the east would have entered a controlled interior rather than walking directly up to the Sphinx. Pillared spaces and a central court organized sightlines, while walls concealed parts of the surrounding landscape. The guardian may have appeared in fragments, its head rising above masonry. Its body revealed only from selected positions, making the encounter more dramatic than the unrestricted modern view. Within the temple, architectural features seem to emphasize both eastern and western directions. Sanctuaries or recessed areas were placed on opposing sides, and the open court admitted moving sunlight. Morning light arrived from the direction faced by the Sphinx. Evening light fell from behind the statue, toward Khafre's pyramid and the western horizon. The building may therefore have staged the sun's passage across the sacred complex, allowing architecture to turn daily illumination into ritual meaning. The exact ceremonies remain unknown. No surviving temple inscription explains the sequence. No complete set of ritual objects has been recovered in its original place. The building's apparent unfinished condition complicates interpretation further. Archaeologists can reconstruct walls, entrances, axes, and stone sources, but the human actions intended for those spaces are harder to recover. What survives in the record suggests a solar and royal program, though scholars still debate whether the temple ever entered full ceremonial service. This uncertainty is unusually important. Major Egyptian cult institutions often leave a dense trail of evidence. Priests recorded titles in their tombs. Families passed temple offices through generations. Estates supplied offerings. Workshops produced objects. Administrative systems tied ritual to land, food, labor, and wealth. Around the Sphinx, clear Old Kingdom evidence for such an established priesthood is missing. There are no securely identified 4th Dynasty tomb titles showing a long-running office devoted specifically to the Guardian. That absence does not prove that nothing happened there. Temporary rites may have accompanied construction, royal burial, or dedication. Priests attached to the broader Khafre complex may have used the area without bearing a special Sphinx title. Later damage may have erased evidence. Yet the possibility remains that the Sphinx Temple was never completed enough to support the cult its designers envisioned. A monument capable of dominating the plateau may have begun its existence beside an institution that failed to take permanent root. The nearby Valley Temple presents a different picture. Constructed with huge limestone core blocks and faced with polished granite, it was part of Khafre's funerary complex and stood near the lower end of the causeway. Its interior once contained royal statues, including powerful images of Khafre seated beneath the protection of Horus. These sculptures multiplied the king's presence. A visitor did not encounter one portrait but a controlled assembly of royal bodies, each expressing stability, renewal, and divine legitimacy. The Valley Temple may have played a role in funerary ceremonies, though the exact sequence is still debated. Traditionally, such temples are understood as places connected to the arrival of the royal body from the river valley, purification rites, and the transition toward the pyramid complex. The ancient waterways near Giza would have brought processions close to the lower temples. From there, the causeway led upward across the plateau, turning physical movement into a symbolic ascent from the cultivated east toward the royal tomb in the west. The Sphinx lay beside this path, not directly upon it. That position allowed the Guardian to watch the transition without blocking it. Processions moving toward Khafre's pyramid passed along the northern edge of the enclosure. Depending on walls, elevation, and the state of construction, participants may have seen the Sphinx's head above the trench while the body remained partly hidden. The monument's scale would have unfolded gradually. It may have appeared less like a statue standing nearby and more like the living rock of the plateau recognizing the king's passage. The causeway itself may have been older in conception than the completed Sphinx design, because its route constrained the northern wall of the enclosure. This suggests that the Guardian was inserted into an architectural program already taking shape. Yet once carved, it transformed that program. The lower complex was no longer merely a route between river and pyramid. It became a landscape watched by a royal lion, aligned with the sun, and physically linked to temples made from its own surrounding stone. Beyond the Sphinx Temple and Valley Temple, the pyramid complex continued uphill. The causeway reached Khafre's mortuary temple beside the eastern face of the pyramid. There, offerings and rituals sustained the deceased king's transformed existence. The pyramid itself marked the western culmination of the route, a geometrically controlled mountain rising above the burial chambers below. The entire arrangement joined multiple scales of royal power: the human-shaped Guardian, the monumental temples, the long causeway, and the immense pyramid. Seen as a unit, these structures expressed movement through opposites. The Nile Valley lay east, the desert necropolis west. Sunrise faced sunset. The living approached the dead. The horizontal body of the lion rested beneath the vertical mass of the pyramid. The Sphinx looked outward toward the world, while the pyramid sealed the king within stone. The temple spaces between them allowed ritual to connect these opposing conditions. At certain times of year, the evening sun deepened those relationships. From the Sphinx Temple area, the setting disk could appear close to Khafre's pyramid, especially around the equinoctial seasons. The king's monument became part of the horizon through which the sun disappeared. The Egyptian word for horizon carried associations of emergence and transformation, and pyramid complexes could exploit such visual effects deliberately. The alignment does not reveal a complete theological script, but it shows that the placement of architecture was sensitive to celestial drama. The Sphinx's later name, Horemakhet, Horus in the horizon, seems almost inevitable in such a setting. Even if the title originated centuries afterward, later worshippers were responding to a visual reality already built into the site. The guardian faced the rising sun while Khafre's pyramid received the sunset behind it. The monument stood at the meeting point of royal body and cosmic cycle. Yet the possible incompletion of the Sphinx Temple casts a shadow over this perfect design. Some of the immense core masonry appears to have awaited finishing. The original pavement may never have been fully installed. The intended facing stones were incomplete, or removed so early that their history is difficult to reconstruct. The temple may represent a plan interrupted at the edge of fulfillment. A ruler's death offers one possible explanation. Royal building programs could lose momentum when the king who sponsored them died. A successor had obligations to complete burial arrangements, but also needed to establish his own authority and projects. Resources might be redirected. Designs could be simplified. Political transitions rarely leave clean archaeological signatures, so no single explanation fully accounts for the unfinished state. There may also have been practical difficulties. The Sphinx's limestone was weaker than the polished surfaces of statues and temple facings. Damage could have begun early. Sand may have accumulated in the enclosure, creating a persistent maintenance problem. A cult centered on a statue lying below plateau level required constant clearance and repair. The very method that made the monument extraordinary also made it vulnerable. If the temple never functioned as planned, then the Sphinx began as a paradox. It was one of the largest royal images ever created, yet its first ritual life may have been brief, incomplete, or absorbed into the broader Khafre complex. It watched over an architecture of extraordinary ambition, while parts of that architecture remained unfinished. The guardian may have been ready before the institution meant to serve it. This would help explain why no exact successor appeared. Later rulers could commission sphinxes that stood on temple avenues or before gateways, where they were easier to install, dedicate, maintain, and integrate into active cult systems. They could carve colossi from transportable blocks and place them within established sacred precincts. Repeating the Giza experiment meant repeating not only the statue, but the quarry, trench, temples, causeway, pyramid, solar alignment, and administrative burden surrounding it. The Sphinx therefore did not fail as an image. Its image endured for millennia. What may have failed, or at least remained incomplete, was the first system built around it. The silent temples beside the guardian preserve that possibility, a royal vision almost fully expressed in stone, yet perhaps never fully awakened through ritual. The first enemy of the Great Sphinx was not an invading army, an iconoclast, or a thief. It was the landscape itself. The monument had been carved below the level of the surrounding plateau, inside a deep enclosure that acted like a basin. Wind crossed the western desert carrying fine sand. and the very trench that made the lion's body visible also gave that sand a place to settle. Once maintenance weakened, the enclosure began to fill. The paws disappeared first, then the lower chest and flanks. Eventually, only the head and upper back could remain above the advancing surface, turning a colossal body into what looked from a distance like a disembodied face rising from the earth. This process probably began far earlier than later legends suggest. Giza's royal complexes required continuous labour to remain active. Temples needed priests, offerings, repairs, cleared paths, and supplies. Sand had to be removed repeatedly, not once. A monument cut into low ground could not simply be finished and forgotten while remaining fully visible. It demanded an institution capable of fighting the desert year after year. If the original Sphinx Temple never developed into a strong, permanent cult centre, the Guardian may have lost that protection relatively quickly. The Sphinx's burial was not a single event. It was a cycle repeated across centuries. Sand accumulated during periods of neglect. Then rulers or officials cleared portions of the enclosure when the monument gained renewed importance. After another lapse, the desert returned. Each excavation exposed stone to sunlight, wind, salt, and human intervention. Each reburial protected some surfaces while trapping moisture and mineral salts against others. The Sphinx survived not through uninterrupted preservation, but through alternating periods of concealment and exposure. The limestone body was especially vulnerable. Its softer layers absorbed moisture from the ground and atmosphere. Water moved through pores in the rock, carrying dissolved salts. When the surface dried, those salts crystallized and expanded, loosening grains and causing flakes to detach. Daytime heat and cooler nights added repeated stress. Wind carried abrasive particles across exposed stone. Occasional rain entered fractures and ran down the enclosure walls. The head, carved from harder limestone and standing higher above the sand, resisted more successfully. The body, trapped closer to the ground and formed from weaker beds, deteriorated more severely. This unequal weathering helps explain the Sphinx's patched appearance today. Large portions of the lion's sides are no longer the untouched 4th Dynasty surface. Ancient masons added limestone blocks where the original core had decayed. Some repairs followed the body's contours carefully. Others created stepped or irregular surfaces that revealed different periods of intervention. Mortar, block size, dressing techniques, and the relationship between repair layers allow archaeologists to distinguish phases, though not every patch can be dated securely. The monument therefore resembles an ancient ship repaired plank by plank while remaining in service. Its identity rests in the original bedrock core, but much of what protects that core belongs to later hands. The Sphinx is both one sculpture and many restorations. Mapping projects have treated its surface almost like a historical document, recording masonry, fractures, mortar, tool marks, and geological layers at close scale. Instead of asking only what the statue looked like when new, researchers can read how successive generations understood and tried to save it. Some of the earliest major repairs may have occurred during the New Kingdom, when the monument returned forcefully to royal attention. By then, roughly 1,000 years separated Egypt's rulers from the age of Khafre. The pyramids remained visible, but their original cults had changed, declined, or disappeared. The Sphinx had become an ancient object even to ancient Egyptians. Its makers belong to a remote past, and its original name may already have been lost. The most famous episode of renewal is associated with the prince who would become Thutmose IV. A granite stela erected between the Sphinx's paws records a story in which the young prince rested near the monument during a hunting excursion. The Sphinx appeared to him in a dream, identifying itself with the solar deity Horemakhet and promising kingship if the prince cleared the sand from its body. The account is royal propaganda as much as personal memory, written after Thutmose had become king. Scholars debate how literally the event should be read, but the image at its centre is revealing a buried god asking to be released. The story confirms that sand had engulfed much of the monument by the 18th dynasty. The clearance associated with Thutmose IV was not merely conservation in the modern sense, it was an act of religious and political renewal. By uncovering the Sphinx, the king presented himself as the chosen restorer of an ancient divine presence. The monument, in return, legitimized his rule. Whether the dream preceded his accession or was composed afterward, the logic was powerful. The older the Sphinx appeared, the greater its authority became. Restoration changed the guardian's identity. The 4th dynasty image, probably connected to Khafre's royal complex, was now openly worshipped as Horus in the horizon. New kingdom rulers constructed chapels, left stelae, and associated the site with solar devotion. The Sphinx became part of a revived sacred landscape extending beyond the incomplete plans of its first builders. Its second life may have been more clearly documented than its first. Yet even royal attention could not defeat the sand permanently. Clearance campaigns removed enormous quantities of material, but prevailing winds continued to carry more into the enclosure. Walls and protective barriers could slow the process. Priests and workers could maintain access while the cult remained supported. Once resources shifted, the basin filled again. The monument repeatedly returned to partial invisibility. This burial altered how later visitors imagined it. A fully exposed lion-bodied figure invites questions about kingship and architecture. A giant head emerging from sand invites legends. When the body vanished, the face seemed detached from human scale. Travellers could see a colossal countenance without understanding the buried anatomy beneath it. The monument became easier to interpret as an ancient oracle, a natural wonder, or a relic from a world beyond ordinary history. The desert also preserved parts of what it concealed. Buried masonry escaped some wind abrasion and direct sunlight. Pigment traces survived in protected places. At the same time, sand could retain moisture and salts against the stone, producing deterioration that remained hidden until excavation. Burial was neither purely destructive nor purely protective. Its effects depended on depth, drainage, exposure, and the condition of each limestone layer. During later periods, political instability and changing religious priorities reduced maintenance again. The temples of Giza no longer stood at the center of state ritual. Building stone was removed from ancient structures for reuse. Granite, limestone facing, and smaller blocks became resources for later construction. The Sphinx could not be carried away because its body was the plateau itself, but detachable elements were lost. The beard fell or was removed. The uraeus disappeared. Masonry around the paws and flanks broke down. The original painted surface faded. The absence of its nose has inspired a particularly persistent myth that soldiers serving Napoleon shot it away with cannon fire. Drawings made before Napoleon's arrival already show the nose missing, so that story cannot be correct. Earlier accounts attribute the damage to deliberate mutilation in the medieval period, perhaps by an individual angered by local reverence toward the monument, though the exact circumstances remain uncertain. Close examination suggests that tools were used to remove the nose, with cuts driven into the bridge and beneath the nostrils. The damage was deliberate. but the identity and motives of the person responsible cannot be established beyond doubt. The face suffered other injuries that were less dramatic but more relentless. Fine details blurred, the mouth changed, ears and headdress edges weakened, natural fractures widened. Later restorers sometimes saved vulnerable areas while also obscuring the original surface. Every attempt to repair the Sphinx carried risk. New stone could place pressure on old stone. Hard mortar could trap moisture or behave differently from the limestone around it. A repair suited to one generation might become a problem for another. By the modern era, excavation was increasingly tied to archaeology rather than royal devotion. But the basic challenge remained unchanged. Clearing the Sphinx made it visible to study and visitors, while also exposing it to the environment. Removing sand was not the end of preservation. It was the beginning of continuous responsibility. Drainage, groundwater, salt crystallization, air pollution, wind erosion, tourism, vibration, and unsuitable restoration materials all had to be considered. Modern mapping has made this layered history visible in unprecedented detail. Surveyors recorded the core rock and the masonry casing separately. Photogrammetry, laser scanning, drones, topographic measurements, and ground-penetrating radar created digital records of the monument and its surroundings. These techniques do not restore the lost face or reveal every date, but they allow small changes to be tracked and past interventions to be studied without cutting into the stone. The mystery becomes measurable. A crack can be mapped, a repaired block compared, a surface monitored through time. The Sphinx seen today is therefore not simply what survived from Khafre's reign. It is what survived nature, neglect, devotion, excavation, and restoration. Its long burial did not erase it. Instead, the sand repeatedly removed the guardian from history and returned it under a new identity. Each generation that uncovered the monument believed it was recovering something ancient, yet each also altered what the next generation would inherit. The lion's body was carved to appear permanent, but permanence required endless labor. Without workers, the desert closed over it. Without repairs, the softer stone broke apart. Without renewed stories, its original purpose faded. The Great Sphinx endured because it was never preserved in only one way. At times, people saved it by clearing the sand. At other times, the sand itself sheltered what remained. The guardian survived not by defeating the desert, but by disappearing into it again and again. By the time Prince Thutmose rested in the shadow of the Sphinx, the monument already belonged to a past so distant that even Egypt's royal court could no longer see its beginning clearly. Nearly 1,000 years had passed since the great building age of Giza. Dynasties had risen and failed, capitals had moved, temples had gained wealth and lost it, foreign rulers had entered Egypt, and native kings had restored control. The pyramid still dominated the western horizon, but the system that created them had become remote. The Sphinx remained, half buried, its original name unrecorded and its first cult uncertain. It was no longer simply a monument from the reign of one king. It had become an ancient presence waiting to be interpreted. The account placed between its paws tells how that interpretation took shape. According to the text now called the Dream Stela, the young Thutmose came to the Giza Plateau before he was king. He was hunting or exercising in the desert, a setting appropriate to a royal prince displaying strength and control beyond the cultivated valley. At midday, he rested in the shadow of the Sphinx. Sleep overtook him, and the buried guardian appeared in a dream. The god identified himself with the solar forms Horemakhet, Khepri, Re, and Etum, then complained that the desert sand was pressing upon his body. If the prince cleared the monument, the god promised that kingship would follow. The scene is perfectly constructed for royal memory. A prince enters the desert, approaches an ancient god, receives a hidden promise, and later fulfills the command. The monument chooses the ruler before the throne is his. Restoration becomes evidence of divine favor. Whether the dream occurred exactly as described cannot be known. The stela was erected after Thutmose IV had become king, and royal inscriptions were never neutral diaries. They shaped events into statements of legitimacy. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate whether the story reflects a genuine personal experience, a later political composition, or a carefully polished version of both. One reason the account has attracted suspicion is that Thutmose IV may not have been the most obvious heir to the throne. The dream's promise could therefore have helped explain why he became king, presenting his accession not as the result of court rivalry or circumstance, but as the decision of a god older than the reigning dynasty. Yet the text does not provide enough information to reconstruct a secret succession struggle. The popular idea that the stela proves Thutmose seized the throne from an elder brother goes beyond the surviving evidence. What can be said more securely is that the inscription gave his kingship a supernatural foundation rooted in Giza's immense antiquity. The choice of the Sphinx was especially effective. A newly built temple could honor a king, but it could not lend him the authority of deep time. The Sphinx had already watched centuries pass. Its original royal identity had faded enough for it to be approached as a deity in its own right, by presenting himself as the monument's chosen restorer. Thutmose joined his reign to the most imposing achievements of Egypt's ancestral kings, without needing to claim that he had built them. He became the ruler who listened when the ancient guardian spoke. The sand in the story was not merely literary decoration. The enclosure truly had filled, probably leaving much of the lion's body concealed. Clearing it required organized labor and would have created a dramatic physical transformation. Workers removed the accumulated desert from the pores, chest, flanks, and temple area. Walls may have been built or repaired to slow further intrusion. Damaged stone received attention. The guardian that had appeared as a head above the sand gradually regained its body. This act of excavation changed more than the monument's visibility. It gave the Sphinx a renewed religious identity. The stela named it Horemakhet, Horus in the horizon, and surrounded that title with additional solar associations. Khafre represented the morning sun coming into being, re-expressed the sun in its powerful daytime form. Atum was linked to the setting sun and completion. By gathering these divine names around the Sphinx, the inscription placed the monument within the whole solar cycle. The lion-bodied king of the Fourth Dynasty became a god spanning dawn, daylight, sunset, and renewal. The later name matched the landscape with remarkable force. The Sphinx faced east towards sunrise. Behind it, the pyramid stood against the western sky. Its head rose at the boundary between desert and valley, earth and heaven, royal cemetery and living Egypt. Calling it Horus in the horizon did not require later priests to understand the exact intentions of its first architects. The form and position of the monument already invited such an interpretation. The new kingdom did not invent the solar landscape, but it gave that landscape a surviving name. Thutmose's restoration also altered how people moved around the site. A buried relic became an accessible sanctuary. Chapels, stelae, offerings, and royal visits increasingly surrounded the Sphinx. Princes came to display devotion and leave records of their presence. The Plateau became a place where royal youth, military skill, solar religion, and ancestral authority met. The guardian's lower position, once a practical weakness because it collected sand, now gave worshippers a contained sacred space beneath the looming pyramids. The dream, Stela itself, was placed between the forepaws, turning the body of the Sphinx into a monumental frame for the king's story. The inscription could not be separated from the god that supposedly delivered the promise. Anyone approaching the chest encountered both the ancient figure and the later ruler's explanation of it. This was not simply a label added to an old statue. It was an attempt to control the meaning of the monument by placing a new narrative at its center. Yet the stela also preserves uncertainty. Parts of its text are damaged, and later readers have sometimes treated gaps as invitations for speculation. One broken passage has been used in arguments about the Sphinx's original builder, because traces have been interpreted as containing the name Khafre. The reading is debated, and even if Khafre's name appeared, the text was written many centuries after his reign. It could reflect New Kingdom tradition rather than direct 4th Dynasty memory. The stela is therefore essential evidence for how the Sphinx was understood under Thutmose IV, but it cannot by itself settle every question about the monument's creation. What it does show is that forgetting had become productive, because the original identity was no longer securely attached to the statue. The Sphinx could be reborn as something broader. It remained royal, but no longer belonged only to one dead king. It became a divine guardian capable of granting rule to a living prince. Its age became part of its power. The loss of its first name did not reduce its sacred authority. It made the monument available for reinvention. This pattern is common in long-lived sacred places. Later generations rarely preserve the past unchanged. They select, rename, repair, and interpret it according to present needs. Thutmose IV did not restore the Sphinx to a perfectly known original state. He restored it into the religious world of the 18th dynasty. The act was conservative and creative at once. Ancient stone was respected, but its meaning was renewed. The dream story also transformed the desert from an enemy into a dramatic participant. Sand had hidden the god, but concealment made revelation possible. The buried body created the need for a chosen restorer. The monument's vulnerability became the basis of royal legitimacy. A practical maintenance crisis was recast as a sacred command. After Thutmose's reign, the Sphinx no longer stood only as the mysterious remnant of the Pyramid Age. It possessed a new biography, one that could be read from the stela between its paws. It had spoken to a prince. It had promised a crown. It had been released from the desert and named as Horus in the horizon. The original builders may have intended a guardian tied closely to Khafre's complex, but the new kingdom gave Egypt a deity whose authority reached far beyond that first program. The Sphinx survived because later Egyptians did not insist on understanding it exactly as its makers had. They allowed it to change. Beneath the same royal headdress, the face could represent an old kingdom king, a solar god, an ancestral protector, and the source of a ruler's destiny. Thutmose IV's restoration did not solve the mystery of the monument. It ensured that the mystery would become sacred. Once the Sphinx had been restored as Horemakhet, it no longer belonged only to the vanished world of the 4th dynasty. It entered a new religious life shaped by rulers who saw the pyramids not as recent royal projects, but as monuments from an age of ancestral power. The Giza Plateau became a place where kings could approach the authority of deep time, and the Sphinx stood at the center of that encounter. Its original connection to Khafre remained embedded in the landscape, but its later identity became broader, more flexible, and more useful. It was now Horus in the horizon, a solar god, a royal protector, and a witness whose age seemed to place it closer to creation itself. New Kingdom devotion did not erase the monument's royal character. Horus was the divine model of kingship, and every reigning pharaoh presented himself as Horus on earth. To worship the Sphinx as Horemakhet was therefore to approach a god who embodied both solar renewal and royal legitimacy. The human face and lion body already expressed the union of intelligence and force. The later cult transformed that visual statement into an active religious presence. The Sphinx was not merely a representation of power. It became a being believed capable of recognizing, protecting, and legitimizing rulers. Princes and officials visited the Plateau, leaving stelae and inscriptions that recorded devotion, petitions, and royal identity. These monuments turned the enclosure into a landscape of memory layered around the older statue. Each visitor approached the same colossal body, but encountered it through the beliefs of a different age. Some came to honor the solar god, others emphasized military strength, royal succession, or the protection of the throne. The Sphinx could receive these meanings because its original inscription was absent. Silence gave later generations room to speak around it. The plateau also offered a setting suited to royal performance. The desert edge was associated with hunting, chariot driving, archery, and displays of physical skill. New Kingdom princes could present themselves there as vigorous heirs capable of mastering the dangerous margins beyond cultivated Egypt. The lion-bodied guardian reinforced that image. The ruler who approached Horemakhet did not appear weak before an ancient relic. He appeared as the living counterpart of the power carved into the stone. Such visits were probably not open pilgrimages in the later popular sense. Access, ritual, and royal display would have been shaped by status and administration. Yet the Sphinx increasingly became a destination rather than merely part of an abandoned funerary complex. Offerings, chapels, stelae, and repeated clearance created a sacred focus within the ruins of Giza. The Pyramid Age had ended, but the plateau remained spiritually active because later Egyptians found new uses for its antiquity. The monument's solar meaning continued to deepen. The Sphinx faced the eastern horizon, where the sun emerged each morning. Its later names connected it not only with Horus, but also with different phases of the solar cycle. Khafre expressed becoming and dawn, re-embodied the sun's visible power. Atum represented completion and the western descent. The Guardian's position between sunrise and the pyramid field allowed these ideas to gather naturally around it. It rested in one place while the sun completed its daily journey across the sky. The western setting was especially important. To modern eyes, the Sphinx looks outward from the necropolis. To ancient Egyptians, west was the direction of sunset, burial, and passage into the divine realm. The pyramids transformed that direction into a monumental horizon of royal rebirth. The Sphinx stood at the threshold, facing the world of the living while remaining physically rooted in the land of the dead. It could therefore protect both movement toward the necropolis and renewal emerging from it. Protection did not always require the image of violent action. Egyptian sacred guardians often defended by presence, placement, and controlled gaze. A colossal figure facing outward announced that the boundary behind it was not unguarded. The Sphinx's lion body carried the potential for force, while its royal head gave that force lawful direction. Later temple sphinxes would repeat the same principle in more manageable forms, lining roads and entrances in organized rows. The Great Sphinx remained the most immense and geographically bound expression of that idea. Its influence can be sensed in the broader survival of Sphinx imagery. Kings and queens commissioned lion-bodied statues throughout later Egyptian history. Some wore royal headdresses. Others carried individual facial features or inscriptions identifying the ruler. Avenues of sphinxes turned ceremonial movement into a passage through repeated images of protection and kingship. Hatshepsut placed granite sphinxes within her mortuary temple complex at Deir el-Bahri, demonstrating that the form could express female kingship as powerfully as male rule. Much later, ram-headed sphinxes and other hybrid guardians extended the tradition into new theological settings. None of these monuments was a direct copy of Giza. They were usually carved from quarried blocks, transported to prepared locations, and placed within functioning temple systems. Their scale could be impressive, but their relationship to the landscape differed. They were objects installed in architecture rather than architecture and geology fused together. The Great Sphinx's descendants inherited its symbolic language while abandoning the construction method that made it singular. The continuing production of sphinxes also reveals that Egypt did not lose the technical ability or religious imagination required to create monumental sculpture. Later rulers commissioned statues far larger than ordinary human scale. Colossi stood before pylons and temple courts. Obelisks were quarried, transported, raised, and polished with extraordinary precision. New kingdom-building programs at Thebes reorganized entire sacred districts. Egypt had not turned away from monumentality, it had redirected it. This shift matters because the absence of a second Great Sphinx cannot be explained simply by decline. Later periods sometimes possessed greater access to hard stone, broader imperial wealth, and more developed temple institutions than the Fourth Dynasty. The choice not to repeat Giza's bedrock guardian was likely cultural and practical rather than technological. Royal ideology had changed. The center of sacred power had moved. The pyramid was no longer the dominant form of kingship. Temple complexes, processional routes, obelisks, pylons, and colossal seated or standing rulers offered more adaptable ways to express divine authority. The Great Sphinx became more valuable precisely because it was not repeated. Its uniqueness enhanced its antiquity. A second monument of the same type might have created a tradition. The absence of one made Giza's guardian appear primordial. Later Egyptians could treat it as something inherited from a near-mythic age, older than their own institutions and therefore worthy of restoration. Its singularity became part of its sacred status. The evidence for later devotion is clearer than the evidence for its earliest cult, but it is still incomplete. Stelae preserve selected royal acts, not the daily experience of every visitor. Chapels and repairs show attention, but not always the full ritual program. Sand repeatedly disrupted access. Political and religious changes altered the resources available for maintenance. What survives suggests periods of intense renewal separated by neglect, not an uninterrupted cult lasting smoothly across centuries. Even so, the Sphinx became woven into Egypt's living religious landscape. It was no longer an unfinished component of Khafre's lower complex. It was a god who could grant kingship, a guardian of the horizon, and an ancient witness approached by rulers seeking legitimacy. Its body remained fixed, but its identity moved through time. This ability to change may be the deepest reason the monument survived. A statue tied too narrowly to one forgotten ritual can lose relevance when that ritual ends. The Sphinx was broad enough to be reinterpreted without being emptied of meaning. Lion, king, sun, horizon, and desert remained powerful symbols in every age of ancient Egypt. Later worshippers did not need the original explanation, because the monument continued to generate new ones. The guardian had no architectural heir, but it gained generations of religious descendants, each smaller sphinx, each royal colossus, and each avenue of protective figures carried part of its language forward. The Great Sphinx remained alone at Giza, not abandoned by tradition, but elevated above it, too bound to one landscape to be copied exactly, and too powerful as an ancient presence to require replacement. The injuries of the Great Sphinx are so familiar that they have become part of its identity. A complete nose can now seem almost unnatural when reconstructed in drawings. The missing beard, softened headdress, broken cobra, eroded chest, and patched body make the monument appear older than history itself, as though age alone carved away every feature. Yet its wounds came from different causes at different times. Some were inflicted deliberately, others resulted from weak stone, salt, moisture, wind, neglect, and repairs that outlived the methods used to make them. To read the Sphinx's damaged body is to separate one long ruin into many smaller events. The nose attracts the most attention because the human face depends so heavily upon it. Its absence changes the expression, flattening the center of the face and making the surviving lips appear more prominent. The popular story that Napoleon's soldiers destroyed it with cannon fire has been repeated for generations, but it does not survive comparison with the historical record. Images produced before the French expedition already show the Sphinx without its nose. Whatever happened, it happened earlier. Close examination indicates deliberate removal rather than gradual erosion alone. Marks suggest that tools were driven into the stone around the bridge and beneath the nostrils until the projecting mass could be broken away. Wind may soften a surface and fracture may weaken it, but neither normally leaves the pattern expected from targeted mutilation. Someone wanted the nose gone. A medieval tradition names a religious figure who supposedly damaged the face after objecting to local people making offerings near the Sphinx. The account is often repeated as though it closes the case, but it was recorded after the alleged event and cannot be independently confirmed in every detail. The person named may have been responsible, or the story may preserve a simplified memory of a more complicated episode. Scholars still debate the circumstances. What can be said with confidence is narrower. The nose was already absent before Napoleon, and the surviving damage is consistent with intentional destruction. The reasons behind such mutilation may have been religious, political, or symbolic. Damaging a statue's nose carried a meaning beyond simple vandalism. In ancient and later visual traditions, the nose was associated with breath and life. Removing it could symbolically disable an image, preventing it from receiving offerings or acting as a living presence. Eyes, mouths, ears, and hands were also common targets when people wished to neutralize a statue's power. Whether the Sphinx's attacker understood the old Egyptian theology is uncertain, but striking the center of the face was an unmistakable act against identity. The ceremonial beard disappeared through a different history. Fragments associated with it survive in museum collections, showing that a long formal beard once extended from the chin. It may not have been carved as one continuous piece with the original head. Some researchers suspect that parts of the beard were added or renewed during later restoration, perhaps when the Sphinx's divine identity became more explicit. The evidence remains incomplete because the attachment area has suffered heavily, and the surviving fragments do not preserve the entire sequence. A monumental beard placed beneath the chin required support. It may have rested against the chest or been connected through masonry. Over time, fractures, weathering, and the failure of supporting stone caused sections to fall. Its loss changed the proportions of the face. The beard would have drawn the eye downward, visually linking the head with the chest and making the royal or divine character more obvious. Without it, the head appears smaller and more isolated above the lion's body. The royal cobra that once rose from the forehead has also vanished. This uraeus was not decoration without consequence. It represented a protective goddess ready to strike the king's enemies and was among the clearest signs of royal authority. The remains around the forehead suggest that such an emblem once existed, though its exact size and form must be reconstructed. Its removal or collapse stripped the face of another element that originally made it more forceful. The headdress itself has lost much of its outer shape. The side lappets that once framed the head are worn and incomplete. Edges that would have appeared sharp under paint have become rounded by erosion. The ears and temples have suffered, and cracks pass through areas weakened by natural bedding in the limestone. The surviving head is made from stronger rock than the body, but stronger does not mean invulnerable. 4,000 years of exposure have reduced details that royal sculptors intended to appear precise. The body records damage on a far greater scale. Deep recesses have formed where softer limestone layers weathered away. Parts of the neck, chest, shoulders, flanks, and hindquarters have been rebuilt with masonry. From a distance, these repairs merge into the lion's outline. Up close, the monument resembles a map of different eras. Blocks vary in size, colour, dressing, and arrangement. Mortars belong to different campaigns. Some repairs preserve the shape of the body with great care, while others form thick protective casings that obscure the original core. Ancient Egyptian restorers were among the first to confront the problem. By the New Kingdom, the Sphinx was already old and damaged enough to require substantial work. Later rulers did not view repair as falsification. Restoring a sacred image renewed its power. New blocks could be placed over decayed stone, surfaces recut, and missing features reconstructed without anxiety about preserving every original tool mark. Their goal was to keep the divine form functioning. Roman period attention may have added further modifications, walls, pavements, and repairs around the enclosure. Later interventions are harder to separate because stone was reused and earlier masonry disturbed. The Sphinx did not pass through neatly labelled conservation phases. Each generation inherited an already altered monument and made decisions with the materials, beliefs, and knowledge available at the time. Modern restoration introduced new risks. Cement-rich mortars and hard masonry can appear stable when first applied, but they may behave differently from ancient limestone. If a repair is less porous than the stone behind it, moisture can become trapped. Salts may crystallize at the boundary, causing the original core to decay while the modern patch remains apparently firm. A strong repair can therefore damage the weaker monument it was meant to protect. This problem became especially visible during 20th century conservation efforts. Some blocks loosened or failed. Areas of the body required urgent attention. Disagreement arose over how much damaged material should be removed, what kind of mortar should be used, and whether the monument should be restored to a smoother outline or preserved as a visibly layered ruin. No single explanation or technique fully accounts for every area, because the Sphinx is not made from one consistent material. A method that works on the harder head may be unsuitable for the softer body. Water is among the most persistent threats. Moisture rises through porous stone from the ground, enters through rainfall, and condenses under changing atmospheric conditions. Dissolved salts travel with it. As the surface dries, crystals grow within pores and push grains apart. This process can continue invisibly beneath an apparently stable exterior until flakes or larger sections detach. Wind then removes the loosened material. The famous grooves and recesses are therefore not the work of one agent but the cumulative result of geology, moisture, salt, exposure, and time. Debate over erosion has sometimes been pulled into claims that the Sphinx must be thousands of years older than mainstream archaeology allows. Proponents point to rounded channels on the enclosure walls and argue that only heavy rainfall in a much earlier climate could have produced them. Most Egyptologists and geologists working within the archaeological context do not accept this as proof of a prehistoric sphinx. They note that weathering can result from multiple processes, including rainfall, runoff, groundwater, salt action, wind, and differences between limestone beds. The monument's relationship to Khafre's complex remains strong. Erosion is real, but its appearance does not provide a simple clock. Lost masonry complicates the surface further. Some stones fell naturally, others were removed for reuse. Valuable casing and paving could be carried away when the temples no longer had institutional protection. Smaller blocks were easier to take than the bedrock core, leaving the Sphinx stripped of elements once essential to its original form. The monument survived partly because its main body could not be dismantled without destroying the plateau itself. Its wounds have also shaped its modern mystery. A complete royal statue might appear easier to place within Egyptian art. A damaged face invites projection. The missing nose creates an expression that seems secretive. The absent beard weakens obvious signs of kingship. Eroded surfaces look less manufactured and more geological. Damage has made the monument appear stranger, older, and more detached from the civilization that carved it. Yet the scars do not remove the Sphinx from history. They draw it deeper into history. Every repair block shows that someone considered it worth saving. Every mutilated feature records a moment when its image still seemed powerful enough to attack. Every clearance from sand represents renewed attention. The Guardian's broken body is evidence not of abandonment alone, but of repeated confrontation between stone and human intention. The Sphinx survives without its original face, surface, colour, beard, cobra, and much of its untouched body. Still, the essential form remains unmistakable. A king's head rises above a lion anchored to the plateau. The damage has not erased the image. It has transformed the monument into something its builders could never have designed, a colossal record of all the generations that worshipped, neglected, injured, excavated, repaired, and misunderstood it. The weathered enclosure of the Great Sphinx has become one of the most contested surfaces in archaeology. Its walls are cut by rounded hollows, vertical channels, softer bands worn deeply beneath harder ledges, and irregular recesses that seem at first glance to preserve the memory of water. To some observers, these marks suggest rainfall far heavier than anything associated with the dry Giza plateau of the 4th dynasty. From that observation comes a far-reaching claim. Perhaps the Sphinx was carved thousands of years earlier, during a wetter climatic period, and only later absorbed into Khafre's pyramid complex. The argument is dramatic because it appears to make geology contradict archaeology. Yet the stone does not speak with one voice, and weathering is rarely governed by a single cause. Rain did fall at Giza in antiquity. The region was not always identical to the desert environment seen today, and the long climatic history of northeastern Africa includes wetter phases, changing vegetation, shifting drainage, and episodes of stronger precipitation. Even during predominantly arid periods, occasional storms could send water across exposed limestone and into the Sphinx enclosure. The existence of rainfall erosion is therefore not controversial. The dispute concerns how much rain was required when the most visible channels formed, and whether those channels can be used to date the carving itself. Advocates of an earlier sphinx emphasize the rounded appearance of certain weathered surfaces. Wind-driven sand, they argue, tends to cut differently, producing sharper abrasion or horizontal effects rather than broad vertical grooves. If heavy rainwater repeatedly ran down the enclosure walls, then the statue might belong to a time when the Sahara was much wetter, perhaps long before dynastic Egypt. In popular versions, this possibility expands rapidly into a lost civilization capable of monumental stonework before the rise of the pharaohs. The first problem is that erosion does not begin only after a statue is carved. The limestone outcrop existed for an immense span of geological time before royal workers arrived. Natural fractures, exposed surfaces, groundwater movement, and earlier weathering could have affected the rock before the enclosure reached its final form. Quarrying then exposed fresh surfaces while leaving others partly inherited from the natural landscape. The monument therefore contains several geological histories layered together. A channel visible today may not correspond neatly to one period of rainfall after construction. The second problem is that limestone responds differently from one layer to the next. Harder beds project outward while softer beds retreat. Water follows cracks and weak zones, but salt crystallization can enlarge the same features. Moisture rising from below may weaken the stone without leaving the signature of a dramatic storm. Wind removes loosened grains after water, and salt have already damaged them. Condensation, runoff from the plateau, intermittent rain, burial beneath damp sand, and repeated excavation all interact. The resulting surface can look water-worn without requiring one ancient age of relentless rainfall. The Sphinx enclosure also creates its own microenvironment. It lies below the surrounding plateau, gathering sand, moisture, runoff, and salts. Water reaching the trench can remain longer than it would on an exposed slope. Buried sections of the body may absorb moisture while the head dries rapidly in sunlight and wind. When workers clear the enclosure, newly exposed stone enters a different cycle of heating and evaporation. Over centuries, alternating burial and exposure can deepen weathering in ways that are difficult to reproduce through a single modern comparison. This is why the erosion debate cannot be settled merely by looking at photographs and deciding which agent the grooves resemble. Geological interpretation requires the study of bedding, fracture patterns, drainage, mineral content, repair history, and the wider archaeological setting. Even specialists may disagree over the relative contribution of each process. The evidence remains incomplete, but incomplete evidence does not make every chronology equally likely. The mainstream dating of the Sphinx rests on more than the appearance of its surface. The monument is physically integrated with the architectural program usually associated with Khafre. Its enclosure was cut beside the king's causeway. Blocks quarried from around its body were used in the Sphinx Temple. That temple stands beside the Valley Temple and below Khafre's pyramid. The entire lower complex appears to belong to a connected sequence of construction during the 4th dynasty. To move the Sphinx thousands of years earlier, an alternative explanation must account for all of these relationships. One possibility sometimes proposed is that Khafre's builders merely discovered and renovated a much older statue. Yet no clear archaeological layer separates an early prehistoric carving phase from the Old Kingdom quarrying and temple construction. There is no earlier settlement, tool assemblage, inscription, or associated monumental tradition demonstrating that a civilization capable of carving the Sphinx existed at Giza before dynastic Egypt. The absence of such evidence does not prove absolute impossibility, but it makes the claim far less persuasive than the connected 4th dynasty context. The nearby temples are especially difficult to detach from the statue. Their core blocks correspond to stone removed from the enclosure, showing that the carving of the body and the construction of the temple were closely linked. If an earlier sphinx had already existed, later workers would still have had to recut the trench extensively during Khafre's reign. In that case, much of the weathering now used to argue for an earlier date could not predate the Old Kingdom excavation, because the relevant surfaces would have been newly exposed or reshaped. The geology, therefore, does not simply stand apart from the architecture, it is part of the same sequence. The size and form of the head also fit Egyptian royal sculpture of the Pyramid Age more readily than a hypothetical prehistoric culture. The Neme's headdress, royal facial conventions, and lion-bodied symbolism all belong securely within dynastic Egyptian art. Claims that the head was recarved from an earlier lion remain possible only in a broad physical sense. The surviving stone does not provide decisive evidence for such a transformation. A smaller head can be explained by the limited harder rock available at the top of the outcrop. The recent experimental work involving Yardang-like erosion adds a subtler possibility without requiring a radically earlier civilization. Wind and natural weathering may have shaped the original limestone mass into a rough form that suggested a reclining animal. Ancient builders could then have recognized and refined that profile. Under this interpretation, nature participated in the monument's earliest outline. But Egyptian workers still created the Sphinx during the Old Kingdom. The study does not date the statue, nor does it prove that the outcrop already resembled a lion. It simply shows that erosion can produce forms capable of guiding human imagination. This middle ground is less sensational but more consistent with the evidence. The monument need not be either a completely artificial design imposed upon untouched stone or the surviving work of an unknown civilization. It may have emerged from an existing geological shape that became meaningful at the exact moment Khafre's builders were transforming the plateau. The quarry supplied the material, the outcrop offered the core, and royal ideology supplied the final identity. The climatic history of Giza still matters. Changes in rainfall, groundwater, Nile channels, and desert conditions shaped construction and preservation. Ancient waterways made the pyramid fields more accessible than they appear today. Later aridity helped sand bury the Sphinx repeatedly. Rare storms cut channels and carried salts. The monument's surface is therefore a record of environmental change as well as human work. But environmental history does not overturn archaeological context simply because the stone looks older than expected. Dating any monument requires multiple lines of evidence. Inscriptions are ideal but absent here. Architecture, quarry relationships, artistic form, construction sequence, landscape planning, and geology must therefore be weighed together. No single element provides perfect certainty. Khafre's name is not carved upon the chest. The exact year of construction is unknown. The order of every nearby wall and temple cannot be reconstructed beyond dispute. Yet the combined evidence still places the Sphinx most convincingly within the 4th dynasty. The erosion controversy survives because the monument encourages doubt. Its body appears partly natural, its face is damaged, its earliest name is lost. Its temple may have been unfinished. The stone has been exposed, buried, repaired, and exposed again. Every uncertainty creates room for a much older story. But mystery does not require abandoning the strongest evidence. The Sphinx can remain extraordinary without being prehistoric. Its true geological story may be more complex than either side prefers. Rain fell, wind blew, groundwater rose, salt grew within the pores, sand sheltered and damaged the surface. ancient workers carved through layers already shaped by nature. Later restorers concealed parts of the core beneath masonry. The result is not a clean weathering clock, but a palimpsest of climate, stone, and human intervention. The dating debate therefore ends where responsible archaeology often ends, not with absolute proof, but with a hierarchy of explanations. A far earlier Sphinx is imaginable, yet unsupported by the broader record. A 4th dynasty monument associated with Khafre accounts for the architecture, symbolism, quarry sequence, and landscape with fewer assumptions. The weathered walls do not destroy that conclusion. They remind us that even the strongest interpretation must remain open to refinement as new surveys, geological models, and conservation data reveal more about the stone. Beneath the Great Sphinx, the bedrock does not contain the vast hidden city imagined in modern legend. It contains something more difficult to describe and, in archaeological terms, more useful fractures, cavities, narrow passages, restoration trenches, geological weaknesses, and a small number of openings whose histories are only partly understood. The distinction matters. A natural void can become a tunnel in retelling. A repair shaft can become an entrance to an underground archive. A patch of disturbed ground detected by instruments can become a chamber before a single stone has been excavated. Around the Sphinx, uncertainty rarely remains empty for long. The monument encourages subterranean speculation because so much of it already belongs below ground level. Its body lies inside a deep enclosure cut into the plateau, and its pores extend from a floor lower than the surrounding desert. From outside the trench, the head appears above the ground while much of the lion remains hidden. Even when fully cleared, the Sphinx looks as though it is still emerging from the earth. It is easy to imagine that what can be seen is only the upper part of something larger. Ancient and medieval traditions added their own layers, stories developed around secret wisdom, buried treasure, protective magic, and knowledge preserved from a world before catastrophe. In later esoteric traditions, the Sphinx became the supposed guardian of a hidden hall containing the records of an earlier civilization. The most famous modern version describes a hall of records beneath or near the pores, where the history of humanity was allegedly stored before a great flood. No archaeological evidence has confirmed such a chamber. The idea belongs to modern occult belief rather than to surviving ancient Egyptian texts. The attraction of the story is understandable. The Sphinx has no inscription explaining its construction, and the silence beneath its pores feels almost deliberate. The monument faces east as if guarding an entrance, yet no doorway is visible. The pyramid complexes behind it contain chambers and passages, while the Sphinx appears solid. The absence of an interior can seem suspicious only because modern viewers expect great monuments to hide something within. But the Sphinx was not built as a hollow structure. It was carved from a limestone core attached to the plateau. Its symbolic power depended on mass, not internal space. Even so, several real openings have been recorded around the monument. One lies behind the head, and has sometimes been described as a shaft or passage descending into the body. Another opening was identified near the rear of the monument, and smaller cavities or gaps have appeared through damaged areas and restoration masonry. Their origins are not all equally clear. Some may be natural fractures enlarged by water and erosion. Some may have been created by ancient restorers examining unstable stone. Others may result from modern excavation or conservation work. The opening behind the head is particularly useful for understanding how quickly fact turns into legend. It has been entered and examined, but it does not lead into a grand chamber beneath the plateau. The passage is limited, irregular, and closely connected to natural cracks in the rock. It may have been explored or modified in antiquity, perhaps during repair. Its presence proves that people sometimes entered the stone mass, but it does not prove that the Sphinx was designed with an internal system. Near the back of the lion, another shaft has generated similar interest. Accounts of early explorers are not always precise, and excavation records from different periods can use inconsistent names for the same features. Sand repeatedly filled openings. Later clearances exposed them again, and restoration altered access. This makes it difficult to reconstruct when every cavity was first discovered or modified. What survives in the record suggests a mixture of geological voids and human intervention, rather than a coherent hidden plan. Natural fractures are unavoidable in a monument of this kind. The limestone plateau contains joints created by geological stress long before the Sphinx existed. Water entered these cracks, salts expanded within them, and weathering widened weaker zones. When workers carved the body, they inherited that fractured structure. Later restorers sometimes filled gaps with stone and mortar, concealing openings that modern surveys would detect as differences in density. A void on an instrument screen may therefore represent a crack, an old repair pocket, loose fill, or a genuinely excavated space. Detection is only the beginning of interpretation. This is why modern researchers use several methods together. Ground-penetrating radar sends electromagnetic signals into the ground and records reflections from changes beneath the surface. Seismic techniques measure how vibrations travel through rock. Electrical resistance surveys can identify areas that hold moisture or differ in composition. Photogrammetry and laser scanning map the visible monument in precise three-dimensional detail, allowing surface fractures to be compared with possible subsurface features. Drones record the enclosure from angles impossible to reach safely on foot. These tools have transformed the study of the Sphinx, but they do not create transparent images of the underground. Radar does not produce a photograph of a chamber with walls and a doorway. It produces patterns that must be interpreted according to geology, moisture, depth, and equipment limits. An anomaly means that something below differs from the surrounding material. It does not automatically reveal what that difference is. Earlier geophysical surveys reported anomalies around the Sphinx, including areas near the pores and along parts of the enclosure. These findings have frequently been presented online as proof of hidden rooms. In scientific practice, the conclusions are more cautious. Some responses may correspond to natural cavities, fractured limestone, compacted fill, or archaeological features. Without excavation or independent confirmation, their exact nature remains uncertain. Excavation itself is not a simple solution. Digging beneath or beside the Sphinx could destabilize already fragile stone. The body rests on weak geological layers, and the enclosure is affected by groundwater, salts, drainage, and centuries of repair. Opening a cavity could change air circulation or moisture levels. Removing fill that has supported a fractured area might cause collapse. Archaeological curiosity must therefore be balanced against conservation. The monument's modern preservation history has made this caution essential. Earlier excavators sometimes cleared sand rapidly without fully understanding how exposure would affect the limestone. Restorers applied materials later found to be unsuitable. Today, non-destructive methods are preferred whenever possible, particularly in areas where the structure may be unstable. The goal is not merely to find something hidden. It is to avoid damaging the evidence already visible. New digital projects now combine historic maps with modern surveys. Detailed records from earlier mapping campaigns show the bedrock core, repair masonry, mortar, geological layers, and tool marks. These can be compared with laser scans, topographic measurements, radar results, and photographs taken decades apart. The result is a far more accurate model of the monument's physical condition. Changes in cracks, stone loss, and repair movement can be monitored before they become catastrophic. The wider Khafre complex is also being examined with non-invasive technology. Muon radiography, which measures particles passing through stone, has been used in the study of pyramids because hidden voids affect the number of particles reaching detectors. Ground radar, thermal imaging, and other remote techniques have made Giza one of the most technologically examined archaeological landscapes in the world. Yet these methods also create a new form of temptation. A preliminary anomaly can circulate publicly before specialists have determined whether it represents architecture, geology, or measurement noise. Claims of a second sphinx or vast underground structures beneath Giza illustrate the problem. Dramatic headlines can transform unverified interpretations into apparent discoveries. In some cases, no archaeological excavation has taken place. No peer-reviewed analysis supports the claim, and specialists familiar with the plateau reject the conclusion. The phrase possible anomaly disappears, replaced by hidden structure found. The Sphinx's reputation does the rest. No confirmed evidence currently supports a second colossal sphinx buried near the first, a secret city beneath the plateau, or a hall of records beneath the pores. This does not mean that every cavity has been mapped, or that no unknown archaeological feature remains nearby. Giza is complex, repeatedly altered, and incompletely understood. Future surveys may identify shafts, construction trenches, storage spaces, quarry features, or natural chambers not yet documented. But discovery must begin with evidence, not with the shape of the story people hope to find. The genuine underground mystery is less theatrical. It concerns how the builders managed fractured bedrock, how ancient restorers entered damaged areas, how water moves beneath the enclosure, and how unseen weaknesses threaten the monument today. These questions may not promise lost libraries, but they determine whether the Sphinx survives. The Guardian does not need a hidden chamber to remain mysterious. Its greatest secrets are already present in the uncertain boundary between natural rock and human design. Beneath its body lies not a proven archive of forgotten civilization, but the same limestone plateau from which the monument was released, cracked, layered, partially explored, and still capable of producing signals that must be interpreted with patience rather than wonder alone. The absence of a second Great Sphinx can be misleading if it is treated as evidence that Egypt lost the ability or desire to build on a colossal scale. It did neither. Long after Giza, Egyptian rulers quarried obelisks weighing hundreds of tons, raised enormous temple pylons, carved seated kings larger than houses, and filled ceremonial roads with rows of sphinxes. At Thebes, royal buildings spread across landscapes as ambitious as anything attempted in the Old Kingdom. What disappeared was not monumentality, but one highly specific combination of geology, architecture, kingship, and place. To repeat the Great Sphinx exactly, a later king would first have needed the right stone. The monument was not created from a block selected in a quarry and carried to a temple. Its body depended on a naturally elevated core of limestone left within the Giza plateau. That core had to be large enough to contain a lion, strong enough at the top to preserve a human head, and positioned where an enclosure could be cut around it. The surrounding stone also had to be useful for construction, allowing the excavation of the body to contribute blocks to the temple beside it. Such conditions were not impossible elsewhere, but they were uncommon, and there is no reason to assume that another royal complex offered an outcrop equally suitable. Geology alone does not explain the absence. Egyptian rulers regularly overcame difficult materials when the political and religious purpose justified the effort. A later pharaoh could have commissioned a huge block-built sphinx or carved another bedrock mass if the form had remained central to royal ideology. Instead, the meaning of kingship changed, and the monumental language used to express it changed as well. The Fourth Dynasty concentrated extraordinary resources on pyramid complexes. The king's tomb dominated the western horizon, while temples, causeways, harbours, quarries, and settlements were organised around it. At Giza, architecture expressed the ruler's transformation through enormous geometric forms. The Sphinx belonged to that world. It joined the king's body to the strength of a lion, faced the rising sun, and rested below the pyramid that marked the royal passage into the west. Its meaning depended on the entire arrangement. After Giza, royal pyramids continued, but they generally became smaller and were built with different internal methods. This change was not a simple story of decline. Resources, religious priorities, administrative systems, and preferred building locations shifted. Fifth Dynasty rulers increasingly emphasized solar worship through temples dedicated to the sun god, particularly around Abu Sir. These complexes used open courts, obelisks, altars, and carefully arranged sight lines to express the relationship between king and sun. The sacred landscape remained monumental, but its centre of gravity moved away from the single gigantic pyramid and its bedrock guardian. The change can be seen as a redistribution of royal symbolism. At Giza, the pyramid, causeway, temples, and sphinx formed a tightly unified statement. Later rulers spread meaning across different structures and institutions. A sun temple could support an active priesthood and receive regular offerings. A smaller pyramid complex could still sustain the king's funerary cult. Temples could be expanded by successors, creating visible continuity between generations. A colossal bedrock statue offered less flexibility. Once carved, it could not be relocated, enlarged easily, or reorganized to suit a new theology. The unfinished condition of the Sphinx Temple may also have discouraged imitation, though direct evidence for such a decision does not survive. The original complex demanded constant maintenance. The enclosure collected sand. Weak limestone required repair. The statue's low position made access and drainage difficult, if its first cult never developed fully. Later architects may have seen no advantage in repeating a form whose visual power exceeded its practical usefulness. The monument succeeded spectacularly as an image, but perhaps less completely as the centre of a functioning institution. Later sphinxes solved many of these problems. They were carved from transportable blocks and placed where temple planners needed them. They could stand before entrances, line processional roads, or appear in courts alongside inscriptions naming their owners. Their scale ranged from small devotional objects to massive royal figures, but they were integrated into active sacred spaces rather than trapped inside a quarry trench. If damaged, they could be repaired, moved, replaced, or supplemented by additional statues. Hatshepsut's mortuary temple provides a clear example. At least 6 granite sphinxes of the female king once formed part of the complex at Deir el-Bahri. Their lion bodies and royal faces continued the same symbolic union of physical force and legitimate rule seen at Giza. Yet their material, arrangement, and architectural purpose were different. They belonged to a planned temple environment in which repeated images guided movement and multiplied the king's sacred presence. The form survived because it adapted. The same is true of the great Sphinx avenues associated with later temples. Repetition became part of the message. A single guardian at Giza embodied overwhelming uniqueness. Hundreds of later sphinxes created processional rhythm, leading worshippers through controlled sacred space. Some carried human heads, others ram heads associated with particular gods. The concept was no longer tied to one royal body carved from one plateau. It became a flexible architectural vocabulary. Colossal royal sculpture also continued without interruption. Amenhotep III commissioned immense seated statues before his mortuary temple in western Thebes, including the figures later known as the colossi of Memnon. Other rulers placed gigantic standing images before temple pylons or within courts. Ramesses II multiplied his likeness across Egypt and Nubia, creating monuments whose scale rivaled the ambitions of the Pyramid Age. Their existence makes clear that Egypt never abandoned the desire to make kings appear superhuman in stone. These later colossi answered different needs. They stood within temple programs centered on gods whose cults commanded vast estates and priesthoods. They could be carved in hard stone, transported from distant quarries, and placed where ceremonies and public approach would give them maximum impact. They displayed the king in fully human form, allowing inscriptions, crowns, poses, and divine companions to identify him clearly. The Great Sphinx, by contrast, lost the name of its ruler precisely because no surviving original inscription securely attached identity to its colossal face. Political geography changed as well. Giza never stopped being sacred, but it no longer stood at the center of royal construction. Memphis remained important, while new centers of power rose elsewhere. Thebes became the great sacred landscape of the new kingdom. Karnak and Luxor offered enormous temple systems capable of absorbing the ambitions of successive rulers. In Nubia, cliffs and river banks inspired new forms of monumental architecture. A king seeking immortality did not need to recreate Giza. He needed to dominate the sacred landscape that mattered in his own reign. The end of the Fourth Dynasty may itself have been less abrupt than later historical narratives imply. Shepseskaf, one of its final rulers, built a large mastaba-like tomb rather than a pyramid, while Userkaf, founder of the Fifth Dynasty, returned to pyramid construction and inaugurated new emphasis on solar temples. Scholars continue to debate what political, religious, or dynastic changes lay behind these choices. Speculative explanations, including astronomical events, have been proposed, but none is established strongly enough to reduce the transition to one cause. What survives suggests a change in direction rather than the collapse of royal capability. The Great Sphinx therefore had no heir because its complete identity could not be separated from its moment. It required the quarry landscape of Giza, the pyramid program of Khafre, a suitable limestone outcrop, the symbolism of the royal lion, the rising authority of solar kingship, and an architectural plan that joined statue, temple, causeway, and pyramid. Remove any one of these elements, and the result becomes a different monument. Later, Egypt kept nearly every part of the idea. It kept sphinxes, lions, royal faces, solar alignments, colossal scale, temple guardians, and sacred processions. It simply recombined them. Granite sphinxes replaced the bedrock body. Temple avenues replaced the isolated enclosure. Colossi replaced the single lion king as the dominant image of monumental royal presence. Obelisks carried solar symbolism upward, rather than spreading it horizontally across the plateau. The guardian's uniqueness was not the consequence of failure or forgotten knowledge. It was the result of historical change. Egypt did not stop thinking on a monumental scale. It discovered other ways to make power visible. The Great Sphinx remained alone because later kings inherited its symbols without inheriting the exact world that had brought it into being. As the religious world that had sustained the Sphinx changed, the monument entered a different kind of afterlife. It remained physically rooted beside the pyramids, but the meanings attached to it began travelling far beyond Giza. Foreign visitors approached with their own myths. Medieval writers described it through rumour and fragmentary observation. European artists turned its broken face into an emblem of antiquity. Archaeologists cleared its body, photographers fixed it into modern memory, and tourism transformed the silent guardian into one of the most recognisable images on Earth. The Sphinx survived the disappearance of its first cult by becoming something no 4th dynasty architect could have planned, a global symbol whose fame increasingly rested on mystery itself. The word Sphinx already reveals part of this transformation. It is Greek, not the original Egyptian name of the monument. In Greek mythology, the Sphinx was usually female, winged, dangerous, and associated with the riddle posed to travellers near Thebes. She destroyed those who failed to answer. The Egyptian guardian at Giza was male, royal, wingless, and created within a very different religious world. The two figures shared a hybrid body and an atmosphere of power, but their functions were not the same. Greek observers nevertheless used their own familiar term, and that name became dominant in later languages. This act of naming quietly reshaped the monument. A royal solar guardian became linked in the wider imagination with riddles, secrecy, and forbidden knowledge. The Great Sphinx itself does not hold a surviving inscription asking a question, yet it became the supreme monument of unanswered questions. Who carved it? Whose face does it bear? What name did its makers use? Why was it not repeated? The Greek myth did not explain the Egyptian statue, but it gave the statue a narrative role that fitted its silence almost too well. Under Greek and Roman rule, Giza remained a place of fascination. Visitors left marks and inscriptions, approached ancient monuments as wonders, and interpreted them through the religious and intellectual habits of their own time. The pyramids were already impossibly old by then. The Sphinx had undergone restorations, periods of burial, and changes in worship. Roman period activity around the enclosure suggests that the site still attracted attention and received maintenance, though the exact use of every structure remains uncertain. Ancient tourism, pilgrimage, antiquarian curiosity, and religious practice could overlap in ways difficult to separate. As Egypt became part of Christian and later Islamic worlds, the religious identity of the Sphinx shifted again. Its cult did not continue unchanged, but the statue remained too immense to disappear from memory entirely. Much of the body could vanish beneath sand, leaving the head as the most visible feature. Writers heard stories about an ancient guardian, an idol, a talisman, or a monument connected with hidden treasure and the protection of the land. Local names and traditions developed independently of the Greek myth, and not every account can be traced securely to direct observation. One Arabic name associated with the monument, often rendered as the Father of Terror, captured the emotional force of the giant face rising from the desert. The expression should not be treated as an ancient Egyptian title, but it shows how later viewers encountered the Sphinx as something uncanny, a human face of impossible scale, stripped of its original paint and partly buried, no longer appeared as a carefully maintained royal image. It looked like the surviving head of a being too large for the world around it. Medieval accounts sometimes describe the Sphinx with striking inaccuracy. Some writers had never seen it. Others relied on travellers whose measurements, directions, and identifications were uncertain. Sand concealed much of the form, making it difficult to understand the full lion body. The pyramids themselves attracted legends of treasure, ancient science, and survival through a primeval flood. The Sphinx naturally entered the same imaginative landscape. Once the builders' records were lost, explanation yielded to story. The arrival of European travellers did not immediately produce clarity. Early drawings varied widely. Some gave the Sphinx a rounded, almost feminine face. Others altered its proportions, added features, or placed it in landscapes shaped more by artistic expectation than observation. Yet these images are historically valuable because they record the monument's changing state. They show how much of the body was exposed, which features were already missing, and how the enclosure looked before later excavations. They also prove that the nose was gone before Napoleon's army reached Egypt. The French expedition at the end of the 18th century transformed European engagement with ancient Egypt. Soldiers, engineers, artists, and scholars documented monuments with a level of systematic attention rarely attempted before. Their presence also fed later myths, including the false claim that French artillery destroyed the Sphinx's nose. More importantly, the expedition helped turn Egypt into a vast field of scientific, artistic, and imperial interest. The Sphinx became not merely a wonder described by travellers, but an object to be measured, drawn, compared, published, and possessed intellectually. 19th century excavation exposed increasing portions of the monument. Sand was removed from around the chest and paws, temples and walls were traced, and the dream stela became central to historical interpretation. These efforts produced valuable discoveries, but excavation methods varied greatly. Clearing was often driven by the desire to reveal spectacular architecture rather than by modern standards of stratigraphic recording and conservation. Sand and debris were moved rapidly. Earlier repairs were sometimes misunderstood. Features could be damaged, displaced, or poorly documented. Photography changed the monument's afterlife again. The Sphinx could now be carried across the world in apparently objective images. Early photographs emphasized its isolation, often framing the face against empty sky and desert. Such compositions strengthened the belief that it stood alone in a timeless wasteland. Even though Giza was always part of a complex landscape of temples, settlements, roads, villages, tourists, workers, and modern expansion. The camera did not simply record the monument. It selected the version of the Sphinx the world would remember. Its face became an ideal symbol for mystery because it seemed both human and unreadable. The damaged mouth could suggest calm, sorrow, contempt, patience, or secret knowledge depending on the viewer. Writers used it as an emblem of silence. Painters placed it beneath moonlight or storms. Poets imagined it watching empires pass. Archaeological uncertainty merged with romantic symbolism until the Sphinx represented not only ancient Egypt, but antiquity itself, withholding its final answer. Modern excavation gradually restored the visible lion body, but each clearance renewed the conservation problem. Once sand was removed, weak limestone faced wind, moisture, salt, pollution, and temperature changes. Tourism brought revenue, public attention, and political pressure to keep the monument accessible, while also increasing vibration, dust, and environmental stress across the plateau. The growing city approached from the east, changing air quality and drainage. The Guardian still faced sunrise, but the horizon before it was no longer the broad ancient valley alone. Conservation became more scientific and more contested. archaeologists, geologists, engineers, stone specialists, and Egyptian authorities debated how much masonry should be replaced, which mortars were compatible with the ancient rock, and whether the priority should be visual restoration or preservation of surviving fabric. Some modern repairs failed and had to be removed. Others stabilized areas that might otherwise have collapsed. The monument's fame made every intervention visible and politically sensitive. A small falling stone could become international news. Digital recording now offers a different form of protection. Laser scans, photogrammetric models, drone imagery, geological mapping, and historic survey data preserve the Sphinx in measurable detail. They allow researchers to compare the movement of cracks, monitor stone loss, and reconstruct earlier repair phases without relying only on memory or hand drawings. Ground-penetrating radar and topographic surveys investigate the surrounding plateau, while digital archives make older photographs and plans available for comparison. The Guardian has become a vast body of data as well as a monument. Popular culture continues to produce new identities for it. The Sphinx appears in films, novels, games, advertisements, conspiracy theories, and imagined histories of lost civilizations. It guards hidden machines, extraterrestrial secrets, magical chambers, and forbidden archives. These stories rarely describe the archaeological monument accurately, but they reveal how completely the Sphinx has become detached from any single historical interpretation. Its silence allows every age to place its own mystery behind the face. This fame can obscure the real achievement. The Great Sphinx is not remarkable because it needs an impossible explanation. It is remarkable because ancient Egyptian builders recognized a geological mass, carved it into a royal lion, integrated it with temples and a pyramid landscape, and created an image capable of surviving the loss of almost every original explanation. Greek myth gave it a riddle. Medieval tradition gave it terror and hidden treasure. Modern archaeology gave it chronology, mapping, and conservation. Global culture gave it endless reinvention. The monument has changed from sacred presence to ruin, from ruin to archaeological object, and from archaeological object to universal icon. Yet beneath every later interpretation, the same limestone body remains attached to Giza. Its fame has travelled farther than any pharaoh's authority, while its original face continues to look east from the place where it was carved. The Guardian once protected a royal landscape. It now guards the boundary between what history can recover and what imagination refuses to leave empty. The Great Sphinx has no heir because there was never another moment exactly like the one that produced it. The Guardian did not arise from a single idea that later Egyptians forgot how to repeat. It emerged from a rare convergence, a suitable limestone outcrop, a quarry already being cut for a royal complex, a king whose pyramid reorganized the western horizon, a state able to command immense labor, a religious language joining lion, ruler, sun, and horizon, and an architectural plan in which statue, temple, causeway, valley, and pyramid belong to one another. When that convergence passed, the symbols remained, but the form did not. Its uniqueness is not evidence of technological loss. Later rulers quarried granite, transported obelisks down the Nile, raised pylons, filled temples with enormous statues, and carved sanctuaries into cliffs. They made sphinxes for kings and queens, placed them before temples, and repeated them along processional avenues. The knowledge required to shape stone did not vanish. What changed was the purpose for which stone was shaped. At Giza, The lion-bodied guardian belonged to the age of pyramids as overwhelming statements of royal eternity. Its horizontal form faced east while the vertical pyramid rose behind it in the west. Its body came from the plateau itself, and the temple before it was built from the stone removed to reveal it. No later copy could reproduce that relationship merely by imitating the outline. A second giant sphinx carved elsewhere would have been another colossal statue, but not another Giza sphinx. The original was not only an image, it was a condition of landscape. The Fourth Dynasty builders may not have thought they were creating an exception. They may have expected the monument to become part of an enduring royal cult. The Sphinx Temple suggests a program of enormous ambition, but its unfinished surfaces and the absence of clear Old Kingdom priestly titles raise the possibility that the institution around the statue never fully matured. Perhaps the death of a king interrupted the work. Perhaps resources shifted. Perhaps the monument functioned within the broader Khafre complex in ways that left few independent records. Scholars still debate these questions, and no single explanation fully accounts for the silence. That silence is striking because Egyptian monuments were often covered with names, cartouches, titles, offering formulas, and ritual scenes secured ownership across walls and statues. The Great Sphinx, despite its scale, preserves no undisputed Fourth Dynasty inscription identifying its maker or first name. Its royal face was designed to project permanence, yet the individual behind it became uncertain. The image survived more successfully than the explanation. This may be one reason later Egyptians could remake it so completely. If the Guardian had remained narrowly fixed to one well-documented cult, it might have declined with that institution. Instead, its silence created space. Thutmose IV could approach it as Horemakhet, Horus in the horizon, and place a new royal story between its paws. New Kingdom worshippers could understand it through solar theology. Later visitors could see an oracle, a guardian, an idol, a wonder, or a riddle. The original meaning was not preserved intact, but the figure remained powerful enough to receive new meanings without losing its identity. The Sphinx became eternal not by staying the same, but by changing. Its body demonstrates that principle. Ancient restorers wrapped weak limestone in masonry. Later workers replaced failing blocks. Sand buried the body and preserved some areas while damaging others. Deliberate mutilation removed the nose. The beard broke apart. The royal cobra vanished. Modern conservation added further layers, some successful and some harmful. The guardian that survives is not a pure Fourth Dynasty object. It is the accumulated result of every age that tried to protect, use, attack, uncover, or understand it. Detailed mapping reveals geological beds, carved surfaces, repair blocks, mortar joints, fractures, and conservation campaigns. The eye sees a lion. Archaeology sees a history of interventions held together by the surviving core. Both views are true. Modern technology has made the monument more measurable than ever. Laser scans preserve its contours. Photogrammetry records its surfaces. Ground radar investigates the enclosure, and historic photographs reveal changes through time. Yet the oldest questions remain resistant to precision. No scan can recover the first sentence spoken about the monument. No instrument can identify with certainty the moment when a natural outcrop became a royal design. Technology can show an anomaly below ground, but not automatically whether it is a fracture, trench, or chamber. This is not a failure of archaeology. The past survives in uneven fragments, stone without labels, buildings without ceremonies, repairs without dates, alignments without explanatory texts, and later traditions that preserve memory while reshaping it. Archaeology does not remove every uncertainty. It disciplines uncertainty, separating what is supported from what is merely attractive. That distinction matters at Giza because stories expand wherever evidence is thin. A damaged passage becomes a tunnel to a hidden archive. A radar anomaly becomes a chamber. A natural formation becomes proof of a vanished civilization. An eroded wall becomes a calendar reaching back before dynastic Egypt. Such claims offer a complete secret behind the monument's silence, but often ignore the strongest evidence: the Sphinx's integration with Khafre's complex, the quarry relationships, the temple blocks, the royal iconography, and the Fourth Dynasty landscape. The mainstream interpretation is less absolute but more coherent. Khafre is the most likely patron, though his name is not securely carved upon the monument. The Sphinx was probably created as part of his lower complex, though the exact sequence remains debated. Its body represented royal and solar power, though its first title is lost. Its temple may have been unfinished, though some ritual use may still have occurred. Nature may have suggested the shape of the outcrop, though Egyptian workers transformed it decisively. Each conclusion contains both evidence and restraint. Why, then, was there no successor? There was no prohibition against sphinxes, no collapse of stoneworking, and no abandonment of giant monuments. Later kings invested in different sacred forms. Fifth Dynasty rulers emphasized sun temples and smaller pyramids. New Kingdom rulers built enormous temple complexes, obelisks, avenues, and colossi. Sphinx imagery continued because its symbolism remained useful. The bedrock giant was not repeated because its full meaning belonged to one place and one political theology. Its isolation may even have strengthened it. Repetition makes a type familiar. Singularity makes a monument seem primordial. The Great Sphinx stands alone not as the last survivor of a vanished species of statues, but as a form that never became a species at all. It was an experiment so completely fused with its setting that copying it would have required recreating Giza itself. The Guardian's deepest mystery is not who possessed the secret to make it. It is how one monument could lose its first name, perhaps lose its first cult, suffer burial and mutilation, acquire a new divine identity, outlive the civilization that carved it, and still remain immediately recognizable. Its makers sought permanence through royal power. What they achieved was stranger. The Sphinx endured after royal power changed, after ritual memory broke, and after its face ceased to belong securely to any one king. It had no heir because it did not need one. Later Egypt carried its symbols forward in other forms, while the original remained where geology had fixed it, facing the sun and gathering meanings from every age that passed before its eyes. The light over Giza changes slowly at the end of the day. The valley darkens first, while the upper stones of the pyramids hold the sun for a little longer. The face of the Sphinx loses its details. The damaged nose, the eyes, the mouth, and the weathered headdress settle into shadow until the expression becomes unreadable again. For a moment, the monument returns to something close to silence. The names given to it across 4,000 years fall away. Khafre, Horemakhet, the Greek Sphinx, the father of terror, the archaeological site, the global icon all remain true in their own times, yet none fully contains the figure in the stone. Human beings build because they want memory to hold still. They carve names, raise walls, align monuments with the sun, and place bodies where they believe time will treat them gently. But memory does not remain still. Words disappear, rituals end, faces break. A temple designed for eternity can be abandoned before its floors are finished. A king may become uncertain while the image meant to preserve him becomes immortal. The Sphinx has survived through that uncertainty. It has survived because sand covered it, because rulers uncovered it, because worshippers renamed it, because restorers rebuilt it, and because later generations could not stop asking what it meant. Its story is not one of perfect preservation. It is a story of repeated loss followed by repeated attention. Long after the last visitor leaves, the guardian remains attached to the plateau. Beneath it lies ordinary limestone, fractured and layered. Behind it stand pyramids emptied of their first ceremonies. Before it spreads a modern world its makers could never have imagined. The sun will rise again in the east, touching the face before the pores, repeating a pattern older than every surviving explanation. Perhaps that is the final legacy of the Guardian without an heir, not a hidden chamber, not a forgotten machine, and not a single answer preserved beneath the sand, but a monument that shows how little of any civilization truly survives, and how powerful the surviving fragment can become. The face remains turned toward the horizon, holding no riddle in words, offering no final confession, and keeping watch over the silence where its first meaning used to be.